Azale stirred from her dreams as the morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of her quaint room and cast a harsh bar of light across her face, casting gentle patterns on the walls as it slowly drifted to her face. Tholiareth. Azale once again grumbled a high elven expletive designed specifically for cursing the morning sun when it dared to disturb a perfectly good sleep. With a huff of frustration, she flipped over in bed, yanking the sheets over her head in a desperate bid for a few more moments of darkness and tranquility. Although completely alien and bare, this room was her sanctuary. She did what she could to turn it into a reflection of her elven heritage blended with her personal quirks, but there was only so much one could do. It wasn't something Azale would consider bad, per se, but there was a small annoyance with the curtain. It had become a daily ritual, an unwelcome intrusion into her peaceful mornings. Each and every day Azale would be awoken by this accursed bar of light, and she knew she should have fixed that heaven's damned thing months ago, but procrastination had always gotten the better of her. Every morning, when she woke up, Azale promised herself that today would be the day she finally addressed it, yet after months, the curtain remained untouched. Now that Azale had finally slipped away from the fiery tendrils of the sun, her thoughts drifted between a mix of self-admonishment. She knew she should just stand up and get it over with right now, but the comfort of her bed and the warmth of the sheets were persuasive arguments for dealing with it later. So in her heart, Izzy promised once more, to tackle the issue later. But, just as she was finally succumbing to the lure of sleep once more, an intrusive, incessant, and mind-numbing noise shattered the morning stillness. The horridly loud noise emanating from the black brick-like device on her bedside table caused Azale to groan and thrash under the sheets. Nyar Yareth. The elf growled an expletive for those intruding on one's sleep for selfish reasons as she shot straight up and glared at the otherworldly piece of technology as if it insulted her ancestors. For a moment, the thought of blasting the device with a ball of fire or dousing it with acid to cease its horrible screeching crossed Azale's mind. Such actions would be satisfyingly appropriate for the disruption it caused. Yet, with a sigh of reluctant acceptance, she reached over, grabbed the insufferable device, and answered the thing. What? What do you want? The voice emerging from her throat sounded more like a plea than a demand for an answer. The voice on the other end chirped with an unnatural cheerfulness, "Good morning. This is your scheduled wake-up call. You have a meeting today in a few hours. Wake-up call." Azale's voice rose in disbelief and annoyance. Why do those even exist? She couldn't fathom why anyone would willingly subject themselves to such a torturous ritual. With a huff of exasperation, she hung up and tossed the device across the room in a fit of displeasure. As she lay back down, Azale couldn't help but start rambling to herself about the peculiarity of otherworldly human customs. God's damned humans and their obsession with time, she muttered under her breath. Wake-up call. Who even does that? Why is time so strictly documented and catalogued? Ridiculous. Her mind wandered to thoughts of her own people, where time flowed more like a meandering river than otherworldly human society's rigid clockwork. In her world, time was observed by the seasons and in the centuries, not by some incessant, mechanical ticking or the unrelenting buzz of modern devices. Settling back into her unreasonably comfortable bed, Azale couldn't help but acknowledge that, despite their near-neurotic faults, humans were quite adept at crafting a great many comforts. She let her body sink into the softness of the modern bed as it hugged her form, providing support and warmth in ways that were both foreign and delightful. This Tempur-Pedic mattress was a stark contrast to the simple pallets or hammocks she was accustomed to in her own realm. As she nestled into the pillow, fluffing it to just the right thickness, Azale mused on the human ingenuity that went into creating such a bed. The sheets were smooth and cool against her skin, a soothing sensation that almost made the earlier annoyance with the wake-up call seem trivial. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, enjoying the light yet cozy weight of it. The bed, with its layers of softness and warmth, was like a gentle embrace, lulling Azale closer to the edges of sleep. Her eyelids grew heavy, and her breathing slowed as she began to drift off, the earlier irritation fading into a distant memory. But just as she was teetering on the brink of deep slumber, that awful noise emanated from her device once more. This time, however, it was in a place she couldn't easily reach, having tossed it across the room in her previous bout of frustration. A derisive chuckle that sounded more like a weep of defeat than anything else escaped Azale's lips as she lay there, torn between her unwillingness to leave the sanctuary of her bed and silencing that accursed device. Resigned to her fate, she closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh before throwing off her sheets. Yes. Yes. I'm coming. Azale yelled as she shivered from the cool air suddenly hitting her skin. Ever since she had discovered the joys of silk sheets and feather-soft comforters, she had taken to sleeping in the nude, a luxury afforded by the convenient and hassle-free access to fresh beddings in this realm. The humans, for all their peculiarities, had mastered the art of laundry to an extent that allowed for virtually endless access to clean linens. Wrapping herself in her own arms, she begrudgingly acknowledged the only downside to this indulgence: the frigid air of this realm's winter made emerging from her cocoon of warmth all the more challenging. But then again, she couldn't help but wonder if staying in your soft sanctuary until the air was sufficiently warmed by the afternoon air could be considered a downside. Azale sat there for a moment longer, contemplating the cruel fate that made the bed so inviting yet the act of leaving it so daunting. With a groan of resignation, she finally mustered the will to throw her feet over and make towards the insufferable black brick and her troublesome duty. A little after Azale reluctantly picked up the screaming device and spoke to that petulant human on the other side, she made her way to the bathroom. The chill of the air and the frigidness of the tiles caused her to start shaking as she held herself tighter, but she knew that relief awaited her in the form of one of this realm's most marvelous inventions, the shower. Stepping into the wondrous room, Azale marveled at the ingenuity of this world. The ability to summon hot water to flow endlessly from a spigot mounted high on the wall without magic was nothing short of magical to her. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes when she saw it. The amount of water seemed endless, but she knew for a fact the humans of this realm were capable of truly insane feats when they put their minds to it. When she asked how such a thing was possible without any kind of mage, Azale nearly doubled over when she heard the answer. Her initial introduction to the concept of plumbing had been an experience bordering on disbelief. And when they continued to explain to her how all of their cities were built with an intricate network of pipes solely to supply people with water, both hot and cold, at their convenience, she thought it was absolute insanity. To her, the idea that anyone would entertain such an extensive logistical undertaking for something as basic as water was unfathomable. As the hot water cascaded over her and started to warm her, Azale pondered the stark contrasts between the humans of this world and those from her own. In her realm, independent human societies were far and few in between. Most humans were either subjugated as slaves or lower class, or integrated into larger, dominant cultures. The concept of such an advanced and widespread human civilization, capable of engineering feats like plumbing, was something she hadn't even considered. Yet here she was. Standing there in the shower, Azale couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. The humans of this world had not only handily defeated one of the few dominant civilizations in her world, but they achieved what many would deem impossible or even ludicrous. They had bent the very fabric of their environment to their will, just to make things a little more convenient, to the point that it was both awe-inspiring and, to a certain extent, overwhelming. Wonderful, Azale sighed as felt the cold flee from her body like a specter before a crusader. The way the hot water traced her form, flowing over the contours of her body, was a sensation she had come to relish, while the water's gentle caress seemed to highlight her thin and slender curves. High elves weren't as ample as the humans or their sun-elven cousins, but her people had their own elegant allure. With the stream of warm water blasted down on her, Azale's mind inevitably turned a little more somber. This daily ritual of waking up in a nice and comfortable bed before warming up in the steam, hot shower, was a comfort she had come to appreciate deeply in this new world. Still, it was tinged with a melancholy realization. Many of her friends and associates from her world, the ones she had journeyed with and fought with, would never get to experience these simple pleasures. Her thoughts lingered on Gideon, Elara, Phelan, Soren, Mirella, and Rael. Each of these names was lost to that awful battle. That awful blast. Azale scowled for a second as she allowed the water to pelt her. She felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest, a mixture of sorrow and something else, something akin to guilt. It was a strange, almost foreign emotion for Azale, given her high elven heritage and the longevity of her kind. She was among the younger generation of her people and had lived for over 1,000 years. The concept of deeply bonding with their shorter-lived kin, the Sun Elves, was difficult enough, but the humans? Bonding with anyone who lived for a fraction of your lifetime was almost unheard of in her society. The fleeting lives of humans were often viewed as transient, with barely a few blinks in the eyes of her people. Yet, she felt a profound sense of loss and sadness for a few humans and Sun Elves she had adventured with. Another sigh left Azale's mouth as she turned off the water and stepped out of the shower. But it wasn't until she turned her head and saw her reflection in the mirror that she pondered this internal conflict. Why did she feel this way? Was it simply the lingering trauma from that battle? Was it the sense of loss after knowing she would never have those adventures again? Or had she connected with those who by all rights would be considered her lessers by her people? The memories of her companions, their laughter, their fears, their courage, all of it seemed to linger in her mind like a stubborn tick. But, what most stuck out to her was how they had treated her not as an aloof, ageless elf, but as a friend and equal, sharing in both their triumphs and tragedies. But that was snuffed away under the incessant barks of otherworldly gunfire and deafening explosions. Turning away from the mirror, Azale grabbed her towel and quickly dried herself while entering her room. Her mind remained an entangled mess of thoughts as she pulled clothes out of drawers. Usually, she'd spread an unfathomable amount of outfits on the bed and sit there for a solid hour or two in an attempt to pick what to wear, but today she found herself pressed for time. Once again, that infernal noise that emanated from her device pierced the air, with that damnable jolly human on the other side reminding her that her ride had arrived and was waiting outside. With a contemptuous groan and a roll of her eyes, Azale grabbed the most professional-looking outfit she could and quickly made her way to her chauffeur. And it wasn't long until Azale found herself riding in a sleek black and beastless carriage that she had come to understand as a car. The vehicle was unlike any mode of transport in her world, swift and relatively silent. But like all novelties, the machine's allure wore off and Azale found herself retreating back into her mind, staring out the window. Her gaze didn't focus on anything in particular and would jump from one wonder to the next. She couldn't help but marvel at the sight of the sprawling cityscape around her. It was a stark contrast to the controlled chaos of the military base, as the humans called it, she had initially been brought to. To her, the base seemed like an endless city in itself, teeming with activity and life, a perpetual buzz that never seemed to cease. But now, in the heart of an actual city, the scale and grandeur of human civilization were truly laid bare before her eyes. Buildings of glass and steel towered into the sky. The streets were a labyrinth of activity, filled with a sea of people, each moving with a sense of urgency that Azale found both fascinating and bewildering. Cars zipped past, their horns blaring in a cacophony that melded into the background noise of the city. To be honest, the display left Azale overwhelmed. In terms of grandness, she couldn't help but compare the buildings of this metropolis to the high elven capital of her world, a city that was a marvel in its own right, but one that resonated with a different kind of energy. Here, however, the energy was raw, unbridled, a relentless drive that propelled people forward at a breakneck pace. The humans boasted of even larger cities than this, and if Azale was honest with herself, she didn't doubt them. What they've accomplished so far with their almost insignificant lifespan had left her in awe. And if she thought about it, it wouldn't be long until they'd touched the stars if they hadn't already. As she watched the endless stream of people, each in a hurry to get to their destination, Azale pondered the reasons behind their haste. In her world, time was a river that flowed gently, its passage marked by centuries or at least decades. But here, time seemed to be counted by a second. Each moment was seized and utilized to its fullest potential, like some kind of irreplaceable commodity. However, Azale's contemplation was abruptly interrupted by the sudden halt of her vehicle. Jarred back into reality, the elf scrunched her face in displeasure as an insufferable ringing noise blared out and was accompanied by the flashing red lights. Azale narrowed her eyes and glared ahead as a barrier slowly descended, halting all traffic. Her long ears perked and seemed to flutter half in annoyance and half in interest as she leaned forward to decipher the cause of this unexpected stop. And that's when she saw it, a massive metal beast slowly making its way across their path. Moreover, the monster was pulling an endless stream of crates, each loaded onto its back like some gargantuan caravan. Azale marveled at the thing's sheer size. In her world, such a task would require scores of horses and carts, and even then, it wouldn't compare to the scale of what she was witnessing. As she looked around to see if anyone else had the same reaction as her own, Azale noticed a stark difference in their perception. Instead of wonder or admiration, the faces of the humans around her were marked with impatience and frustration. It was as if this was a routine event. Something so extraordinary to her was nothing more than an inconvenience to them. And that's when it struck her, an epiphany hit her with the force of a paladin's righteous hammer. The reason why these humans were so successful, so driven, was because time to them was indeed an irreplaceable commodity. Everything about their civilization, from the small comforts of daily life to their vast systems of transportation and their horrible implements of war, was centered around logistics and efficiency. It all made sense. This relentless pursuit of efficiency was the cornerstone of this otherworldly civilization, and it was what drove their innovations, their architecture, and their transportation networks. It explained the bustling streets, the crowded sidewalks, and the constant flow of traffic. It was all a dance choreographed by the unyielding tick of the clock, each second accounted for, each moment optimized. As the train finally cleared the crossing and the barrier lifted, the pent-up stream of vehicles rolled into action and continued their journey. Isaelle sat back in her seat, once again retreating into her mind. She pondered over this newfound understanding of humans and how it contrasted so sharply with the more leisurely pace of life in her own world. In her realm, time was a vast and unending canvas upon which the events of the world gently unfolded. But here, time was a precious resource, mined and spent with a fervor that far exceeded any other physical treasure. She couldn't help but wonder why the humans of her realm weren't the same. But the more she thought, the more she started drawing parallels. In her world, humans were often suppressed, their potential stifled under the weight of more dominant cultures. They either integrated into societies where they had little room to grow or were unable to sustain their communities long enough to make a lasting impact. Yet, there was one area where these humans did excel: magic. Human mages, while not as skilled or powerful as the High Elves or even the middling Sun Elves, did possess an extraordinary creative spark. They were more keen on deviating from the norm and exploring the unbeaten path. This led to the development of entirely new classifications of magic as they developed novel spells to solve novel problems, showing a level of inventiveness that often surprised even High Elves. However, their short lives meant they rarely had the chance to refine and in most cases capitalize these innovations into something groundbreaking. In contrast, this world was just full of humans. Without the overarching influence of longer-lived races, they were left to forge their own path and adapt or die in the process. This need for constant adaptation fostered a dynamic, ever-changing, and frankly, chaotic society in Isaelle's eyes. The history book she had glanced at told a tale of unceasing turmoil and change. Wars, revolutions, and discoveries all occurred at a dizzying pace to someone who had lived for over a millennium. Each page was one horror leading to the next in humanity's relentless drive to overcome, advance, and conquer not just new lands, but new ideas. But as fascinating as it was, the instability appalled her. The fact that chaos and constant change were the very engines driving this world's progress left Isaelle sick to her stomach. Without a steady and consistent society, the humans here had been forced into a cycle of perpetual innovation and adaptation. And she couldn't help but think this was exactly what her stagnant world needed. Isaelle's contemplative gaze shifted as the car stopped and her driver's voice rang out. "We're here, ma'am," the man said, startling the poor elf. Several other vehicles pulled up alongside hers, with well-built men in sharp suits emerging and fanning out with practiced efficiency. Her ears twitched as she watched one of the men approach and open the car door for her. Recognizing them as her assigned guards, Isaelle gingerly stepped out of the vehicle, taking in her surroundings with keen interest. She found herself in a sprawling concrete structure, a parking garage full of a variety of vehicles. But a little further away, Isaelle could see a group of white-coated men and women who seemed absolutely ecstatic to see her. "Are they that excited to learn introductory spells?" Isaelle questioned as she scratched behind her ears. "You sure we're gonna find a village this way?" Elijah questioned as he tried to make heads or tails of a poorly hand-drawn map he had in his hands. The man rotated the strange animal skin parchment in his hands as his gaze alternated between it and Azaleen in search of confirmation. In response, Azaleen rolled her eyes in exasperation before impatiently snatching the map from his hands. "What are you, stupid?" she barked while squinting at it critically, turning it around in her hands. "Who holds a map upside down?" "Gods," she chided. Coleman was hanging lazily in the gunner's turret when his foot kicked Bennett's shoulder. "This is why we don't give these two dipshits." "Hey, fuck you." Bennett's voice echoed in the background. "Maps?" The team leader finished as he chomped down on another piece of beef jerky. Azaleen's narrowed her eyes at Bennett before letting out a sigh. "Noted," she replied while flipping the map around and presenting it to Elijah. "See this small river?" She traced her finger along a winding line on the map. "That's where we are." "How are you roaming around this place without knowing anything about the river system?" "That's literally the only landmark here that's not trees or fields." Still staring at the map, Elijah scratched his head in confusion. "I'm not seeing it, champ." "It's just lines," he complained, throwing his hands up in defeat. "Just squiggly lines and blobs of bullshit." Every part of the map seemed to refuse to coalesce into any meaningful form. I mean, what the shit is this supposed to be? The medic then pointed to a particularly crudely drawn section of the map, where the lines seemed to meander aimlessly. Is that a hill or a pit? A town, maybe? Or is that just a grease stain? A derisive laugh left Azaline's mouth as she felt her patience leave her body. She facepalmed hard and dragged her hand down, pulling at her face. They had been having this back and forth for over an hour now, and every time Elijah looked at her map, he bombarded her with questions as if she had personally drawn the damn thing and been to every landmark. In the name of everything good and holy. How in the gods am I supposed to know? Azaline shot back, clutching at the air and flexing in frustration. Maps aren't some all-knowing oracle. They give you a rough idea, and you figure the rest out. Elijah's hands went to his head and expanded outward like an explosion as his eyes fluttered. It was almost as if her words had inflicted actual mental damage on him. What does that even mean? He retorted incredulously. What's the point of a map that isn't accurate? In a dramatic display of exasperation, Elijah got out of the GMV and started gesticulating wildly at Azaline. Oh hey, Ben. According to our fantastic map here, the village we're looking for is. Maybe, in this general direction, he announced in a mockingly high-pitched voice while stomping off with an exaggerated, silly walk. A fit of giggling resounded beside the vehicle, causing its inhabitants to snap their heads to the side and see Yana hovering next to them. She perfectly mimicked Elijah's every movement, even down to the goofy facial expression. Azaline's face contorted with anger as her hostile look snapped between the ferry and Elijah's mocking display. If I weren't so crippled right now, I'd send my boot so far up your ass you'd be spitting out leather and dirt, she snarled while her hands clenched tightly into fists. Jesus preserve me, they're the same goddamn person, Coleman muttered under his breath as his hand went to his face and cringed. Eli, can you stop being an asshole for 5 seconds? He said, pushing in his eyeball to banish the headache forming, just 5 seconds, that's all I want. A flicker of annoyance flashed across Elijah's face as he sighed and started walking back to the GMV. Bennett and Yana, meanwhile, couldn't contain their laughter and continued to cackle at the spectacle. Coleman had enough of the antics, and decided now was a good time to step in to assert control over the situation. We're going to listen to the local, he declared firmly, gesturing towards Azaline. She knows this land and knows what she's doing. Not one to back down easily, Elijah opened his mouth to retort. But the map looks like it was made by an illiterate drunken child, he started but was soon cut off by Coleman's stern voice. Shut up. No. Bad. Coleman scolded, pointing at him with a mix of authority and exasperation. Bad Eli. We're going to listen to the local, and that's that. No more bitching, no more moaning, no more bullshit. Now get the fuck in the car. A growl left Elijah's mouth as he glared at Coleman. However, he ultimately relented and made his way back while a slew of curses left his mouth. What am I, a dog? He grumbled to himself as he stomped his way over. Azaline, on the other hand, had a smug grin on her face. Even though she couldn't understand a word of that exchange, she sensed the tide had turned in her favor. As Elijah begrudgingly climbed into the passenger seat of the GMV, Azaline couldn't resist the opportunity to get the last word in. Dickwipe. Shitbag. Elijah's retort was instant and sharp. Enough. Coleman's voice cut them both off before another round of insults began. Let's just focus on getting to this other damn village. He barked, looking down at the two. Eli, get on the horn with the convoy and get a goddamn sit rep. Christ on a stick, you two are insufferable. The interior of the GMV fell into a heavy silence, the only sound being the rumble of the engine and the crunch of tires on the rough terrain. Elijah, still simmering with frustration, shifted in his seat and snatched the radio, while Azaline continued to smile at him conceitedly. Baron 2, this is Baron 1. How you nerds holdin' up? Elijah said nonchalantly as he let go of the push to talk. Bennett, in the driver's seat of the GMV while peering off into the distance with binoculars, couldn't help but chuckle after such a solid example of NATO radio protocol. Elegant as ever, he said dryly. In an attempt to maintain his cool, Coleman simply shook his head and sighed as he rotated the turret around. After a few moments of silence, a reply came through, Baron 2, copy. Convoy is moving along without incident. Villagers are, well, they're villagers. A bit of grumbling about the pace and the dust, but nothing out of the ordinary. I think The voice from Baron 2 reported with a hint of weariness in their tone. Any chance we can swap out? Over. No, Baron 1 out, Elijah replied immediately and ceased communications. He then turned to Coleman, giving a brief, concise report. They're fine, Elijah said, his voice carrying a note of finality. As Coleman listened to Elijah's report, his expression remained stoic, but internally, he grappled with the challenge of handling his subordinate. Elijah's usual petulant and unpredictable nature often made it very difficult to maintain any semblance of discipline or order within the team. And Coleman knew that when Elijah became obstinate, no amount of reasoning or reprimand would bring him back in line. The best approach, he had learned over time, was to not react in a way that might encourage the medic's more exhausting tendencies and to divert his attention somewhere else. But it wouldn't take long for something or someone to throw a wrench into that plan. Coming out of nowhere, Yana suddenly zipped in front of Azaleen and pointed an accusing finger at the elf. Hey! You shouldn't talk to my human like that, she exclaimed in an angry voice. You're lucky he told me to be nice to you, or I'd set your stupid pointy ears on fire. Azaleen recoiled away from Yana's sudden appearance and threat, and for a moment, she felt a pang of fear. However, this quickly morphed into confusion. She couldn't help but notice that Yana's ears were equally as pointed as her own. But before Azaleen could react further, Coleman interjected once again by letting out a loud and exasperated groan. Oh, for fuck's sake. Eli. The team leader barked and looked down at his medic, who seemed confused and annoyed as to why he was being yelled at. Eli, get in the goddamn turret and take your ferry with you. Coleman barked harshly as he crouched down out of the position in a huff. Jesus Christ. Cats. It's like herding cats. Elijah gave Coleman the side eye as he lifted himself up and maneuvered to climb up to the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the GMV. This is bullshit, the medic grumbled as he hauled himself up after snatching Yana out of the air as she continued to harass Azaleen. I'm a goddess, you know. I'll turn you into a frog, you know. Alt GWAK. The fairy yelped in response and started to struggle. But as quickly as she was scooped out of the air, Yana found herself dumped on top of the cupola rolling around. She flailed for a moment, before shakily standing up and pointing an indignant finger at Elijah. Hey! You can't do that to me. You're my apostle. Yana protested as she stood on her new perch. You're supposed to be nice to me. Ignoring the tiny being, Elijah scowled as he popped open the feed tray of the heavy machine gun and began to check the belt of ammunition, ensuring it was properly seated and ready for action. Once done, he slapped down the feed tray and yanked back on the charging handle with a satisfying chick-chack sound. Meanwhile, Yana took off from her perch and landed on top of the weapon with her hands on her hips, her tiny wings fluttering in agitation. Hey! Hey, listen to me, you stinky ugly face, she barked at Elijah as she stomped her tiny foot, emphasizing each word, I'm your goddess. You should be nice to your goddess. Snapping his eyes to the fairy, Elijah's mouth opened as if to unleash a barrage of insults, but the words filtered as he instead just started flapping his lips as his words seemed to fail him. And in that moment of exasperation, the man began ruffling his hair while Yana glared at him petulantly. Fine. Elijah yelled as he ducked under the cupola and rifled his bags. A few choice words were said as Elijah rummaged through the contents of his assault pack until he finally found what he was looking for, a small strip of beef jerky with red flakes on it. Climbing back into the turret, Elijah shoved the treat towards the still scowling Yana as she glared in reprimand with her hands on her hips. Initially, the small goddess looked as if she was about to retort with another sharp remark on how dare he try to win her over with such insignificant tribute, but one small sniff put an end to that. Yay! Yana exclaimed, quickly grabbing the jerky from Elijah's hands, before buzzing away to the back of the vehicle. Goddamn, Elijah sighed in resignation as he watched the menace fly off. Gimme a break, man. With everyone settling down, a quiet took hold as they each found their rhythm. Coleman pulled himself halfway out of the GMV and balanced himself on the edge of the doorway as he peered over the back of the vehicle. His eyes scanned the terrain behind them, noting the progress of the rest of the team and the caravans they were escorting. The sight of several wagons and carriages, filled with villagers and their meager belongings, slowly cresting over a distant hill signified it was time to get a move on. Coleman's gaze lingered for a moment, ensuring that everything was in place and there were no signs of distress or disorder. Satisfied with what he saw, the team leader then pulled himself back into the vehicle and gave Bennett a firm slap on the shoulder. "Let's get out of here," he ordered quietly, gesturing towards the empty dirt road. The GMV's engine roared to life as Bennett took the wheel and moved in the direction that had plotted out earlier. According to Azaleen, they were getting quite close to a sister village, to the one they had just saved. And with how the forces of this land were conducting themselves, one could only hope they didn't suffer the same fate. Regardless, the team would have to take whatever was going to happen in stride, one step at a time. So acting as the lead scouts for the main body of their team, Coleman and his element drove forward to clear the way and ensure that the path ahead was free and clear. Time seemed to fly by as they journeyed on towards, what they assumed, was the northwest. The terrain suddenly started to change from the vast unending forests and into a valley as the sun began its slow descent in the sky, painting the landscape in hues of gold and orange. The daylight waned, and by the time the sun had finally sat comfortably on the horizon, the team crested a hill that overlooked a breathtaking sight. Before them lay a massive river, snaking through the valley in a majestic, serpentine fashion. Its waters reflected the colors of the sunset, shimmering with streaks of gold and crimson. Alongside the river, a rather sizable village nestled comfortably, its structures harmoniously blended with the natural surroundings. Surrounded by a wooden palisade covered in flowery vines, the village appeared to be a bustling center of life and activity, even from their distant vantage point. Thatched and tiled roofs of varying shapes and sizes dotted the landscape, interspersed with patches of cultivated land. Plumes of smoke rose from several hearths, suggesting the preparation of evening meals. The scene was reminiscent of a painting that displayed the natural beauty and a settlement coexisting in harmony, but there was something off. Coleman brought his binoculars to his face and narrowed his brow when he noticed an unusual and tense confrontation unfolding at the gate. A small contingent of men clad in armor, eerily similar to those that had attacked the previous village, were engaged in what he could only assume was a one-sided verbal confrontation with the inhabitants of the settlement. The armed men gestured aggressively, their body language indicating a heated exchange, while the villagers, though clearly outnumbering the intruders, seemed hesitant and defensive. "We've got a problem," Coleman stated in a monotone voice as the rest of his element did their best to observe the scene through their weapons' small optics. "Eli, can you get eyes on em?" "Yep." Elijah, who was still stationed in the turret, replied as he turned around in an almost lethargically upon hearing Coleman's words. Reaching over the rear of the GMV, the medic grabbed a rather long case made of sturdy cloth before unzipping it and pulling out a 22 Malawian Quach's advanced sniper rifle. Without even deploying the rifle's bipod, he carefully rested the high-powered rifle on top of another piece of secured luggage, creating a makeshift yet stable platform. Popping off the protective caps, Elijah set the optics magnification to max, peered through it to see one of the soldiers take several baskets before slapping some poor woman. "HRMM," Elijah murmured as he watched the scene through the sniper rifle scope. His eyes narrowed as he observed one of the armored soldiers harshly slap a woman to the ground, then roughly grab her arm and drag her along with him. The rest of the villagers reacted with anger and moved aggressively towards the soldiers. The tension escalated quickly, and the soldiers unsheathed their weapons in response to the villagers' advance. However, before the situation could erupt into violence, another villager intervened. This man, evidently a person of some authority or respect among the villagers, flailed his arms wildly, facing his own people as if to stop them from attacking. As the scene unfolded, Elijah tapped his finger on the side of the rifle and continuously clicked his tongue. "Well, that's not good," the man commented dryly, eliciting a few raised eyebrows from his team. "Looks like extortion to me. Food, money, and women." A sigh left Coleman's mouth as his finger drummed against his binoculars. "You think they're a part of that group we just ambushed?" Coleman asked, still focused on the unfolding drama. "Can you get a head count?" Elijah took a deep breath as he counted the figures moving around in the village quietly. "I'd say about 10 or 15, give or take," he finally said as his fingers spun the optics magnification back and forth. He then paused momentarily while fixating on something through the scope. "But, I think they got something big," Elijah added, a hint of seriousness in his voice. I can't really make it out, though. It's just sitting behind some trees." "Shit," Coleman muttered as he put down his binoculars and began to rub his head. There could have been anything in those tree lines, and with limited flexibility and no support, Coleman knew he had to tread carefully, and any wrong call could get him or his team killed. They couldn't risk just waltzing in the place or even taking a pot shot without at least getting an idea of what they're dealing with. Turning towards Azaleen, Coleman gave the elf a hard and inquisitive look. Any idea what these Imperials might have? Hay asked, furrowing his brow as he tried to remember the words in this strange tongue. Anything big and dangerous? Azaleen lifted an eyebrow and scratched her head in thought. Her memory returned to the informant she paid off and how he explained that only the Empire's impoverished goons bothered to be out this deep. You're going to have to be more descriptive than that, she replied as she leaned back in her chair. These guys are most likely more auxiliaries like the ones we fought outside the previous village, so it could be a smaller wyvern, a salamander, or whatever feeble beast the Empire might have burdened those poor saps with as a support element. Coleman shot his head up towards Elijah, who was still peering through the scope of his rifle. Eli, can you give us anything else on the thing? Anything specific? He asked, hoping for a clearer picture. For a few moments, Elijah remained silent as he adjusted his position and watched the creature wiggle around in the thicket. Could be anywhere from 10 to 15 feet long, there are a few spikes, maybe claws, beige or an off-white bottom with blood red on top. Elijah reported in the local language as he squinted his eyes to discern more details. It's hard to make out, but it's definitely trying to stay hidden behind those trees. Looks like it's waiting for something, or maybe just watching. That's a wyvern. Azaleen immediately spoke up. A small one at that. When the sun finally descended over the horizon and darkness enveloped the landscape, the people of this land found themselves in a world transformed. Nighttime in the trees and hedgerows brought a profound darkness that seemed to swallow up someone completely. All it would take was to take a short walk away from the comforts of bonfires and torches of one's camp and they would find themselves in an abyss of shadows, where the familiar became foreign. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig could be a lurking arcane horror or a harbinger of death. At least that was what the old wives' tales or bedtime stories mothers told their children when they ventured too far from their village at night. Sure, unseen dangers were lurking in the thick blackness of night, but for seasoned soldiers of the auxiliaries, the darkness was an old acquaintance. It was nothing more than a familiar adversary they had encountered and bested countless times. Plus they had a damned wyvern. In the makeshift encampment nestled within a secluded grove, a rough-looking man with a face marred by scars surveyed his surroundings with a predatory gaze. His weathered features twisted into a snarl as he watched his men huddling around a roaring bonfire. The air was filled with the crackling of flames and the distant, muffled sound of weeping coming from a tent nearby. "Keep it down in there," he barked harshly towards the tent, his voice rough and commanding. An equally rough and battle-worn man poked his head out from the tent and nodded. "Yes, boss." "Sorry, boss," he replied meekly before ducking back in. The leader's eyes then swept over the rest of his men, his expression darkening with contempt and possessiveness. "And you lot," he growled, "don't you dare ruin her. I want another go when I get back." His words were laced with a menacing undertone, leaving no room for argument or disobedience. With a sharp snap of his fingers, he beckoned to two other men sitting by the fire. "Daysec, Hundre, you're with me. We're joining the others on patrol." His voice left no room for debate as he jerked his head towards the edge of the camp. "And hurry the hells up or I'll feed you to the wyvern instead of that whore." The two men quickly and nervously stood up and picked up their polearms, exchanging a brief and awkward look before jogging over to their scout leader while he stood at the edge of the encampment with his arms crossed. Their leader was not a man to be trifled with. Short of temper and even shorter of understanding, his orders were always absolute. When out in the field away from the main body of their company, it was either his way, or you were fed to the wyvern. "And Sarif, want you on that damned beast looking for the company, first light." The scout leader barked, pointing at a scout platoon's wyvern rider, a sun-elven man that was rifling through baskets for something to chew on. "They can't have wandered far. God's damned idiots." Sarif paused his rummaging and took a bite of a piece of bread before giving the scout leader a nonchalant nod with a look of indifference. "Bram," he drawled casually, "I ain't seein' the point. Saw some bodies of our boys and that useless fop near that village my girl torched when I last went out lookin'. Bram's face contorted with anger at Sarif's casual dismissal. Fueled by rage at the insubordination, he stomped forward, grabbed the collar of the wyvern rider, and pulled him closer. "And I don't give two shits of a demon," he growled menacingly, his face inches away from Sarif's. "You gonna get out there and find something tangible to report back." Even under the scout platoon's leader's intimidating glare, the wyvern rider didn't flinch. He wasn't a part of this ragtag group of fuck-ups, he was a damned wyvern rider. Plus his girl was watching with those steely eyes, and if this brute of a man did anything, then they'd all be torched. The tension between them was palpable, with the rest of the men around the fire watching silently, not daring to intervene or make a sound. All right, fine. Sharif finally relented, putting up his hands, realizing that it just wasn't worth bothering getting into a pissing contest with such an insecure piece of shit. I'll get her nice and prepped. First light. After a tense moment, Bram released Sharif with a shove, pushing him back towards the baskets. Good, he snarled, I'll let her eat the whore when ye, back. As the Werven rider straightened up and brushed off his tunic, he spun around and walked away without another word, leaving these knuckle-draggers to their own devices. The scout leader, still seething with anger, then turned his attention to Dasek and Hundre. Come on, he said gruffly, jerking his head towards the darkness of the night. Each of them grabbed a small magical torch from a pile near the fire and made their way into the darkness. Unlike the mundane fire-lit torch doused in fat or oil, these emitted a steady light that never wavered or flickered. The torches were unique in their construction and operation. A stable ball of flame rotated continuously within a glass housing, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and practical. The magic that powered them was a well-known method but was still only able to be produced by enchanters and artificers. The flames, though confined, cast a reassuring light that pushed back against the oppressive night and provided a small ward against those that lurked the night. The trio ventured deeper into the grove, their steps measured and cautious. Bram's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he led two subordinates through the darkness. Despite the presence of another patrol of 2 men facing the village, he couldn't shake the lingering unease of a lurking danger. That Werven rider's recent reports of a part of their company, along with their commander, being found dead in a field just a handful of miles away, weighed heavily on his mind. This place, he muttered under his breath, it's cursed, I tell ya. Bram's sudden statement caused the other 2 to freeze and snap their heads to him. First the forts and then the company, the gruff man continued as they approached the wide-open plain that overlooked the road leading to the village. Ain't sure what it is, but something ain't right. I've got a gut feeling, ya hear? And it be screamin' at me. Hundre, the younger of the 2, adjusted his grip on his pole arm, his eyes scanning the treeline. You think we should just pack up camp and get, he suggested, his voice tinged with concern. No, the scout leader replied firmly. Then that pussy Werven rider would have a legitimate reason to cut us loose and fuck off. I ain't gonna give our only means of scaring off Grovemaws away. Dasek, running a hand along his beard, looked towards the distant road that stretched up the hill while his face reflected the firelight from their torches. Speaking of Grovemaws, he said, his tone tinged with curiosity and apprehension. You think they might have done the company commander in? We did a lot of killing back at the village, and they're attracted to the blood, right? Stopping in his tracks, Bram rubbed his head as tried to ward away the set of anxiety that was starting to build up. It's possible, he admitted grudgingly. Those damned monsters be everywhere lately. Bram's eyes lingered on the distant hill that led southeast, where a narrow and crude dirt road crested over it. He knew that just a 5-mile trek along that road would bring him to the remnants of the village they had helped destroy. The memory of the burning shoddy buildings and the screams of peasants as he killed them replayed in his memory. On that fat lard of a general's prerogative, the company commander instructed him to seek out any villages in the area and coerce the inhabitants to pack their belongings and move north. If they refused, those villages would be marked for destruction. It was a cruel order, one that left no good options for the peasant farmers who called these lands home, and Bram knew all too well that compliance with the order meant a death sentence for him. They'd be easy prey for the wilderness or worse, bandits. Yet defiance meant certain destruction at the hands of his and his own. There wasn't much pity or the lick in Bram's mind. As a matter of fact, he kinda enjoyed running those soft dirt plowers through. It was too bad they got caught in a game much larger than themselves, but such is life. There was a part of him that took a twisted pleasure in this new assignment, enjoying the power and fear it gave him over these simple folk as he took not just their lives, but their dignity. However, as he stared into the darkness, something else tugged at the back of his mind. There was something out there. He just knew it. Whatever it was watching, waiting and lurking in the dark like a demon. I hope Egon don't break this one like that last peasant girl. Dasek sudden spoke up, sitting down on an overturned log. I'd like to get one more crack at her before he offs em. Hunter's cackling laughter filled the air, resonating through the trees. Me too, mate. I'm plow through her again like that one tavern whore back in Rokelin. Bram clicked his tongue in annoyance. You damn idiot are loud as all hell, Bram growled, his tone laced with irritation. I'm tryin' to think. He turned and walked away. His two crass subordinates cackled and continued their conversation while their irked leader pushed through the brush to the edge of the tree line. Bram's gaze was still fixed on the crest of the hill as he came to stop at the edge of the tree line. You know, Hunter's loud voice carried through the forest. I heard from Tarn up north that there's a village with a seer. Claims she can see the future. Dasek snorted, a seer, eh? Bet she didn't see us coming. Doesn't matter if they be old or young, Egon likes them all. Would be fun to see what sort of future she predicts, while that bastard's on her belly. The two men shared a cruel laugh, while the anxiety poked away at Bram as the conversation behind him faded away. Bram remained at the edge of the tree line, lost in thought, while the oppressive silence enveloped the grove. The absence of vile banter that usually filled the air suddenly felt unnerving, and a subtle sense of dread began to gnaw at Bram. After a few moments, Bram furrowed his eyebrows, puzzled by the sudden quiet. Something felt off. The usual sounds of the night, the distant hoot of an owl or the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, were conspicuously absent. He turned around, intending to check on what Hundre and Dasek were doing, perhaps to berate them for their lack of discipline or to ensure they hadn't wandered off. As he approached the log where he had left them, Bram's steps slowed, a cold realization settling over him. The spot where Hundre and Dasek had been sitting was now eerily vacant. Their weapons and magical torches were leaned casually against the wooden log, as if they had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no sign of the men themselves. Dasek. Hundre. Bram called out, grabbing onto his flangled mace that was sheathed at his side. The scout leader scanned the surrounding foliage, waving his magical torch around while his eyes darting through the darkness, searching for any hint of movement. The silence of the grove now felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on him with an ominous foreboding feeling as he took one step after another. Bram's mind raced with the possibilities of what could have happened. He for a moment thought they may have gone to relieve themselves. But for both of them to do it at the same time and to do it quietly was highly unlikely. Desertion was his next immediate thought, but that was equally absurd. You'd wait for a more opportune time. Gods damn it, you stupid fucks. Where in the hell you gone? Bram bellowed as he pulled out his weapon. Ye keep fucking with me, and I'll. Suddenly a rustling in the brush caused Bram to abruptly silence himself. He snapped his head towards the source of the noise, instinctively shifting his body to face the potential threat. His hand tightened around the grip of his flanged mace, and his other hand steadied the magical torch, casting eerie shadows amongst the trees. The comments Dasek made about Grovemaws came to Bram's mind as his body started to shake with fear. The mere thought of facing an apex predator like a Grovemaw, a monstrous, carnivorous beast, set Bram's heart racing. But if one of those horrid creatures had indeed taken his men, there would have been much more screaming. The silence suggested something else. Show yourself, he demanded, his voice a mix of bravado and underlying fear. But the forest remained silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the gentle night breeze. Bram pointed his torch towards another pair of rustling bushes, trying to pierce the darkness with its flickering light. His breaths came out in ragged gasps as he muttered under his breath, "Ain't no beast gonna eat me." His grip on the mace tightened, ready to swing at the slightest provocation. "I ain't no treat, mm." Before he could finish his sentence, Bram felt a hand violently clamp over his mouth, before jerking his head back sharply. Panic surged through him as he felt the cold, unmistakable sensation of a blade sliding smoothly into the side of his throat. His eyes widened in shock as he attempted to scream and resist, but the man's grip was too tight and only gurgles came out. Then, close to his ear, he heard a whisper in a somewhat jovial voice, tinged with dark humor. "You'd probably taste bad, anyways." The words were chilling, spoken with a familiarity that belied the violent act, and a moment later, the blade was punched forward, ripping open Bram's throat. Shoo, it's okay, it's okay." Elijah cooed as he felt the struggle of the sentry in his arms slowly come to an end. "This is Baron 1-2, all Southern sentries neutralized." He spoke quietly into his headset while his suppressed rifle hung low at his side. He gently lowered the body to the forest floor, ensuring it made no sound that could alert the others in the encampment. As he adjusted his position, the radio crackled softly in his ear. "This is Baron Actual," Coleman's voice acting as the orchestrator of the raid came the voice over the net. Northern and southern sentries neutralized. You're green to go. Elijah nodded to himself, even though no one could see it in the darkness of the night. He raised his weapon, an extension of his will, and started to stalk her forward toward the enemy encampment. The shadows of the forest seemed to embrace him, masking his presence as he moved with the predator's grace. As he moved forwards, moments later, he was joined by several other operators, emerging from the shadows like specters. They moved in unison, like a silent ghostly horror, converging on their prey. Through the phosphorus white glow of their night optical devices, they communicated with hand signals, each member aware of their role in the impending raid. They then fanned out, taking positions that would allow them to cover each other and provide multiple angles of attack. The encampment itself seemed unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the reach of their fires. However, they did seem startled as they looked around uneasily. "This is Baron 2 Actual, we don't have a shot on this wyvern. Continuing with contingency, countdown for execution." A voice crackled in Elijah's ear as everyone shifted the game plan on the fly. "Copy that, Baron 2 Actual," Coleman responded softly over the net, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All elements, stand by." On my mark, he paused, allowing his men to mentally prepare themselves. 3, 2, 1. Execute. In perfect synchronization, the team sprang into action. Elijah and the other operators squeezed the triggers on their weapons, dropping their designated targets with lethal precision. Bodies immediately crumpled to the floor as the suppressed shots echoed harshly through the night. The operators exploded out of their positions, moving forward from different locations as the assault took the shape of an L. This raid was strategically designed to avoid any possibility of crossfire among the team members as they swept through the camp with deadly efficiency. As they approached the enemies, each operator made sure to put one more round into the skulls and bodies of fallen, ensuring the complete demise of their targets. Once a hive of activity, the camp was now eerily silent, save for the muffled sounds of their footsteps and the faint sound of screaming and weeping from one of them. The operators moved cautiously, throwing open flaps, and ending anyone that lingered within. Suddenly, two deafening blasts erupted in the distance, followed by a blood-curdling screech of a beast. Another team engaged the wyvern, adding an unpredictable element to the night's operations. The sound and shockwave reverberated through the forest, causing a naked man to burst out of one of the tents suddenly. His eyes went wide with terror as he came to an abrupt stop when the bodies of his comrades littered the ground and he found himself surrounded by ghostly men. To him, they looked like faceless monsters, here to claim his immortal soul. "Put your goddamn hands in the air, or I'll drill a hole in your head," Elijah yelled, and his tone tolerated no argument. "You fucking move, I'll kill you like your friends." The naked man didn't hesitate. Dignity be damned, his hands shot straight up, his body trembling with fear and the cold night air. As Elijah and his team their new prisoner and the tent behind him, another drama was unfolding on the other side of the encampment. The radio crackled to life again, breaking through the tense silence of the night as an urgent voice came over the net. "It's airborne. +1 rider. Knock it out of the sky." Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes searching the dark sky until the infrared outline of the wyvern's silhouette filled his vision. Now airborne with its rider, the beast sought to make its escape. Meanwhile, at the crest of a nearby hilltop, Coleman and Bennett stood by their ground mobility vehicles, GMVs, each shouldering a FIM-92 Stinger missile launcher. The Stinger, a man-portable air defense system, manpads, was specifically designed for situations like this, to bring down aerial targets anywhere near the ground. As the wyvern beat its powerful wings to gain altitude, Coleman and Bennett took aim, but Coleman's launcher hummed and vibrated first. With his manpad locked on, Coleman squeezed the trigger, causing the first stage to violently eject the missile from the tube before its main motor ignited. The missile arched through the air, rapidly catching up with the fleeing aerial beast. Within moments, the Stinger's proximity fuse detected the wyvern's massive form. A bright orange flash detonated right under the beast's wing, briefly illuminating the night sky and causing the explosion to echo across the landscape. The wyvern let out an anguished roar as it struggled to maintain its flight. But almost simultaneously, Bennett's missile locked onto its target as the second missile chased after the wounded wyvern with unnatural precision. Miraculously, the missile struck the same wing, detonating on impact. A second explosion lit up the night, followed by the creature's blood-curdling scream. Through their night vision goggles, Coleman and Bennett watched the grisly aftermath. The wyvern's wing bent in unnatural ways, the membrane that allowed its flight disintegrating under the force of the explosion. The once mighty beast flailed in the air, its screams piercing the night as it plummeted towards the ground. The operator stood in silence, watching as the wyvern's descent ended with a sinking thud and the screeching coming to a sudden and abrupt halt. Soon a haunting quiet enveloped the area until the radio crackled to life. "This is Baron 1-2, camp has been secured. 1 hostage, plus 1 POW in custody." As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the Special Forces team, along with a few representatives from the decimated hamlet and the abducted peasant girl, cautiously approached the neighboring village. They had decided to wait until morning to approach, aiming to reduce the likelihood of causing panic among the villagers and treat the poor girl who endured a night of horror. The ruckus they had caused the previous night was bound to have put everyone on edge, and Coleman knew handling this situation with care was critical. Their ground mobility vehicles, GMVs, slowly rolled forward as the sound of the engines muffled under the barking of orders from the village gate. The peasants were alarmed and were sent into a flurry of activity as armed themselves with whatever tools they could find. Coleman signaled for the convoy to stop a safe distance away as he looked up at Elijah, who was in the turret again. "You sure this is a good idea?" the team leader asked. Elijah shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly and replied, "I dunno, I guess we're gonna find out," he said while aiming the massive weapon toward the village walls, where a few men were positioned with what looked like crossbows. At that moment, Azaleen chimed in with her usual blunt candor. "Just waltz in, show 'em who's boss, and state you aren't here to hurt them. If any idiot tries anything, use your magic boom sticks to cut down a few, and they'll get the idea." Confusion and disturbance clouded Coleman's features as he turned his head and stared at the elf. "Yeah, we're not gonna do that," he said firmly, dismissing her suggestion outright. The last thing they wanted to do was cut down a bunch of pitchfork-wielding peasants just to prove a point. But as he continued to work his mind for a solution to handling this situation, Coleman's gaze floated to the peasant girl they had rescued. She was being comforted by the survivors of the previous village attack. "You think we should let them lead the way?" he asked, turning back to Elijah and wondering if a familiar face might be a little less threatening. Scratching his head, Elijah thought about the question momentarily as his pocket squirmed restlessly. Probably," he finally responded. "They'd be less likely to attack a bunch of women, especially if they recognized their own in the mix." Coleman clamped his hands together after making up his mind. "Alright, we'll let the girls go first. You and I are gonna go with them," he decided, climbing out of the vehicle. Elijah furrowed his brows in disbelief, shaking his head. Whoa, wait. What? You want us to go with them?" he exclaimed, holding up a hand and letting out a faux laugh while crouching down out of the turret. "Let's think about this for a moment," he said, his tone serious. "We're an unknown element to these people. They've just seen one of their own dragged away by a bunch of dickheads, and suddenly a new set of dickheads show up in these strange, beastless carriages, saying, 'Hey guys, let us in. We're nice, I swear.'" After smoking a Werven, he gestured to the empty field with a Werven corpse in it. "Do you know how fucking insane that sounds? They might just try to string us up or some shit." A scoff left Coleman's mouth as he rolled his eyes and started adjusting his gear. "Quit your yap pin and come on," he retorted sharply, motioning for Elijah to come down from the turret. "You're being a bitch." Visibly frustrated, Elijah brought a hand to his face and started rubbing it in disbelief and exasperation. "This is fucking insane," he muttered under his breath. Crawling out of the vehicle, he grabbed his rifle and barked at Coleman, "You're fucking insane, you know that? I knew you were gonna get me killed." From the driver's seat, Bennett huffed in amusement. "That's rich, coming from you," he commented while he crawled to the turret to man it. Ignoring the protesting medic, Coleman turned to Azaleen. "You good to walk?" "Come on," he said, gesturing for her to follow. Elijah interjected in alarm, "What? No, she's not good to walk. She fractured her hip less than 3 days ago," but he was cut off as Azaleen hissed in pain while pulling herself out of the vehicle and started walking forward, albeit with a slight limp. "What the fuck are you doing?" Elijah basically screamed as his arms flailed. "You can't be fucking walking yet. Do you have any idea how stupid this is? You're going to worsen your injury, you could end up with a permanent limp, or worse." Azaleen waved her hand dismissively at Elijah's concerns. Yeah, whatever, I'm fine," she insisted, "it's not like I haven't messed my hip up before." In an effort to find some other voice of reason, Elijah looked to Bennett and then Coleman, but everyone just shrugged. I saw her walking around yesterday. Didn't seem too bad, Coleman said nonchalantly. With his frustration reaching a boiling point, Elijah brought both hands to his temples, mouthing the words, "What the fuck," in utter disbelief. He then chomped towards Azaleen with his dominant hand and firmly said, "No. No, get back in the..." But before he could finish his sentence, his pocket erupted in a burst of movement. A flash of fire and violet light bolted up to his head. A clearly agitated fairy squished his face together with her tiny hands as a snarl formed on her face. "Shut up. Shut up, shut up, shut up." Yana scolded him, shaking his head around. "How can I sleep with you screaming like a damned banshee? I'll turn you into one, since you like yapping so much." Observing the chaos unfolding around her, Azaleen wore an expression of indifference and numbness. The proper reaction to such a scene might have been to recoil and run away in fear, but she had grown accustomed to the peculiar brand of insanity these humans brought with them. It seemed that every hour was filled with one absurdity after another, and the elf had learned to just deal with it as any other event. Meanwhile, Coleman, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, walked around the ground mobility vehicle, GMV, and hopped onto the back. He began rummaging through the equipment, eventually pulling out 2 compact, ballistic shields. They weren't perfect and were custom-made to use your rifle while providing adequate cover for your torso, so they were a little bulky, but it was better than nothing. "Why do you even need sleep?" Elijah barked back, glaring at the fairy. "Aren't you some immortal shitter that is above such mortal pleasures?" he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity as he swiped at the fairy in a futile attempt to regain some personal space. Effortlessly evading his hand with her nimble flying, Yana hovered in front of Elijah's face, with both hands on her hips. "Because it feels nice," she retorted with a defiant tone. "I don't need a reason to do what I like." Her response, brimming with the whimsical and carefree nature characteristic of fairies, left no room for argument. As Elijah struggled and bickered with Yana, Coleman walked over to the medic. He shoved one of the ballistic shields into his hands, before grabbing the strap of Elijah's plate carrier and dragging him along. "Come on, let's go round up our peasants," he said, apparently completely unperturbed by the situation unfolding around them. Taken by surprise by Coleman's sudden action, Elijah stumbled along, trying to avoid falling over while awkwardly juggling the bulky shield. "God damn it!" the man yelled until he finally found his footing. A giggle left Yana's mouth before she stuck her tongue out at Elijah. "You are the worst apostle ever," she declared and flew off towards the vehicle, heading straight for his pack. Several choice swears left Elijah's mouth as he was unceremoniously dragged along by Coleman towards the group of women who had gathered a short distance away. The women were whispering amongst themselves with expressions filled with concern due to the earlier ruckus. Noticing their apprehensive glances, Coleman jabbed Elijah in the side and nodded towards the villagers. "Tell them everything is fine, we're just spirited and lively, or some shit," he said, wanting to ease the villagers' worries. Elijah's eye twitched for a moment. He was not exactly thrilled with playing the role of an interpreter when Coleman could speak the language, albeit not as fluently. However, he ultimately relented and out a defeated sigh. "Hey, everything's okay," Elijah said in a bored tone. "We're just lively," he explained while shooting Coleman an accusatory and salty look. The women exchanged glances that contained equal parts skepticism and curiosity, but they seemed to relax after seeing the casual body language of the strange warriors. However, they still had reservations about these foreign men's intentions. In their experience, few ever went out of their way to help someone without expecting something in return, and often such help ended with someone being sold into slavery or burdened with extraordinary debt. Among the group, the girl who had been kidnapped by the Imperial auxiliaries shifted nervously. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward while her eyes flitted between the ground, the 2 men, and the palisade in the background. Hello. She began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saving me." She paused, looking back at the ground, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her torn garment. After a brief moment, she looked up again with a hint of trepidation. "I'm assuming you want compensation." Her voice trailed off, the question hanging in the air, reflecting her uncertainty and fear. The soldiers exchanged a knowing look. It wasn't often that a delicate situation provided a solution for itself. Still, they had to be delicate with this situation, especially when it came to the apprehension of a girl who just went through something horrible. We just want you to go talk to your people, so they don't try to attack or anything. Coleman spoke carefully while scratching his head. We're from far away and we're just looking for directions or something. The villager girl stared at Coleman as if he was growing an extra limb out of his head for a moment before looking back at the other women for confirmation. But she only received a mix of hesitant nods and shrugs, signaling their uncertainty and that they have been true to their word so far. Resisting the urge to click his tongue at Coleman's less-than-stellar opening, Elijah seized the opportunity to foster a more personal connection. By the way, I'm Eli and this is Cole, he introduced himself while giving the girl a pleasant smile. What's your name? He asked, his voice carrying a genuine curiosity. The girl hesitated for a moment before responding, I'm Risa. After handing Coleman his shield, a soft clap resounded as Elijah slowly walked towards her, ensuring his hands were visible and empty to show he meant no harm. Well, Risa, it's really nice to meet you, he said, his tone charismatic and casual. We could really use your help talking to your people. We don't want any misunderstandings. We're here to help, not cause more trouble. Risa's expression softened slightly at Elijah's more approachable demeanor. She still felt on edge and was still shaken, especially after what she just endured, but Risa didn't feel any overt maliciousness. Trust was a luxury Risa wasn't sure she could afford, but she also recognized the reality of their situation. After witnessing the corpse of the wyvern in the fields, she understood that resistance against these strangers would likely be futile. Not wanting to anger such powerful beings, Risa bowed her head in deference and performed a crude and unsteady curtsy-like gesture. Why yes, my lord. She said as a sign of respect towards those she perceived as of higher class or importance. Anyone capable of slaying an imperial auxiliary and a great beast like a wyvern must hold significant power or status, and in her mind, this was a problem for someone else. Right now, all she wanted to do was go home and cry herself to sleep in her mother's arms. Right away, my lord. Risa then straightened up and lowered her head. I'll speak with the village head and my father, she said, adjusting her torn clothing in an attempt to keep herself as modest as possible. I believe they'll be more than willing to listen. Coleman's brow furrowed slightly when he heard Risa address Elijah as my lord, a term he somewhat frowned upon. However, it didn't matter how he felt about aristocratic systems and their titles, because Elijah quickly adapted to the circumstance and capitalized on this newfound perception. Lifting his head in a manner that bordered on arrogance but still maintained his friendly smile, Elijah underwent a noticeable shift in disposition. As he walked forward, he said in a light, reassuring tone, "Oh come on, there's no need for that." As Elijah approached, he noticed a subtle but significant change in Risa's demeanor. The closer he got, the more she seemed to shrink in on herself as a visible tension gripped her frame. It was as if she harbored a deep-seated fear, and Elijah wondered if it was directly aimed at him for his role in the violence last night. However, Elijah quickly realized that fear seemed more omnipresent than anything else. More likely a result of what she endured at the hands of those animals. Her body language spoke volumes, her shoulders hunched, and her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, avoiding any direct eye contact. It was as if she was bracing herself for harm. Responding to the shift in her behavior, Elijah immediately slowed his advance and maintained a healthy distance to avoid overwhelming her. You've been through a lot, and we'd like to get you and your people to some semblance of safety. He said gently as he looked between her and the gaggle of women behind her who seemed equally hesitant. Well, I would be lying if I said we're doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. Elijah said as he watched the women both tense and relax at the same time. He knew all too well that coming off as purely altruistic would raise more suspicion than it would alleviate. Selflessness was often viewed with skepticism in these parts, as people were more accustomed to the harsh give-and-take of survival. To be honest, we've actually been hired to sniff out bandits or deserters, and we just happened to stumble over one of those groups of bastards attacking villages. Elijah kept his words vague enough to obfuscate exactly who he worked for as he gestured toward the women behind Risa. These women behind you had their entire village destroyed by those scumbags. But, to cut the chase, Elijah said with a half-smile that made Risa feel as if she didn't have any room to refuse. We're not particularly keen on spending the night outside, he added, gesturing to the village gate. So, some food, water, and a roof over our heads would be plenty for us in repayment. And, we'd also like a little coin or some supplies. Elijah winked at her. I believe that would be fair for our valiant services. Risa was still somewhat guarded, but she visibly softened under Elijah's request for payment. She knew there was going to be a catch, but as luck would have it, the apparent powerful freelancers or lords in front of her were more materially motivated. I'll see what I can do, she replied, her voice still tinged with uncertainty. Our village has been through a lot recently, but I think we can help each other. Elijah's smile widened slightly as a twinkle sparkled in his eye. Wonderful. Maybe you can lead the way and talk to your people for us? He asked, pointing at his shield. Because I don't really think they're gonna respond very well to us. Nodding, Risa shuffled forward as she lowered her head in deference towards Elijah and Coleman. On the other hand, Elijah watched the poor peasant girl scurry away before glancing back at Coleman with a cheeky smile. The team leader stood there, unable to decide whether he should praise or reprimand this manipulative fuck. Heaving a sigh, Coleman settled on just nodding his head. They both knew the importance of this moment, not just for their immediate needs, but for building a semblance of trust in a community they could potentially operate out of. As they followed after the peasant girl, Elijah clapped Coleman on the arm with a bright, annoyingly cheerful voice. Everything's coming together. His enthusiasm seemed almost infectious, if not for the context in which it was delivered. Coleman, however, found himself at a loss for words, torn between admiration for Elijah's adept handling of the situation and disgust. Coleman started, but found himself unable to complete the thought. He remained silent for a moment, rubbing the bridge of his nose, while his medic snickered incessantly. You're a real piece of work, you know that? Coleman finally let out before he started chuckling himself. Ha ha ha, oh my god, he continued, unable to hold back a laugh, despite his earlier frustration. As they passed the GMV, Coleman gestured towards Azaleen, who was still lingering near the vehicle. Come on, let's go get a face full of arrows and pitchforks. He half-joked as the elf woman grabbed her sword with her good arm and started limping along with the two. Ever the instigator, Elijah decided that the best way to add more credibility to their story was to muddle the plot into something indecipherable. Throwing his arm up, Elijah snapped his fingers. Come on, Yana, let's go. He yelled out. Yana, who had been enjoying her moment in the sun atop the .50 caliber machine gun, abruptly sprang up with a snarl on her face. Huh, she exclaimed, clearly irritated that her sunbathing session was interrupted. Looking around, she rolled her eyes dramatically in annoyance, before she let out an exasperated ugh. Then, with a flutter of her wings, she zipped off towards Elijah, though not without muttering a string of fairy curses under her breath about inconsiderate humans and their incessant need for movement. Landing on Elijah's head with the grace of a particularly irate hummingbird, Yana began to tug and pull at his hair, her tiny face scrunched up in frustration. What? What do you want? She demanded, her voice high-pitched and full of irritation as she grabbed onto his long, curly hair and started yanking. Ignoring the now routine bickering, Coleman turned his attention to Risa in the distance. She had stopped just in front of the village gate and started speaking earnestly to the armed men outside. Even from a distance, Coleman could tell she was doing her best to smooth the way for their arrival. Turning to Azaleen, who was silently observing the scene with a thoughtful expression, Coleman asked, what should we expect if things go right? With her gaze never leaving the villagers and the gate, Azaleen pondered on the question for a few moments. If the girl convinces them our intentions aren't to sack their village, they'll likely let us in without much hassle. She said in interest as she rubbed the splint attached to her arm. We'll be watched closely, of course. So expect a lot of suspicion and a few foolish souls trying to test us, she finished as they watched a giant of a man run out of the gate and scoop Risa in a massive hug. Okay, Coleman responded as he started to process Azaleen's assessment. Nodding his head, the team leader's mind was already racing with contingency plans. Okay, well, what if things go wrong? He queried, a hint of concern lacing his voice as they noticed a flood of armed villagers fled out of the gates. Azaleen shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she observed the sudden influx of people. Then we either leave, kill them, or kill them and leave, she stated bluntly in a pragmatic and chilling tone. Coleman ran a hand through his hair as he groaned in exasperation. He momentarily pushed off his headset, allowing himself a brief pause to gather his thoughts before slipping them back on and pressing down on his push to talk. Baron actual to all elements, maintain support by fire positions. Baron 4, you are designated QRF. Be on standby for exfil if this goes sideways. Acknowledge over. One by one, the calls of affirmation came in followed by a litany of activity as the team coordinated their roles. And looking over at Azaleen and Elijah, Coleman gave them a tired look. Let's try to keep this peaceful, alright? I don't want to waste a bunch of farmers with pitchforks. Having finally managed to disentangle Yana from his hair, Elijah gave him a nonchalant shrug as they made their way to the mass of people waiting in the distance. As the dawn broke and the sun began to paint the sky with its first light, the village of Twine Ward was already astir. The arrival of strangers at the gates, mounted in steel, beastless carriages, set a wave of murmurs and unease through the small community. The folk of Twine Ward were hardy, their lives carved from the unforgiving lands surrounding them, but the sight of such oddity just after being harassed by a group of Imperial auxiliaries unnerved the already frazzled villagers. "Oi, Marley! Giggy eyes on that," shouted Bert, a burly man with arms as thick as the logs he split, pointing towards the gates where a small gathering had begun to form. "What in the blazes are they riding in?" Marley, wiping the sweat from his brow with a cloth, squinted towards the newcomers. "Dunno, but they ain't from round here, that's for sure. Best fetch the head and his boy Afton, I reckon." The villagers clutched their spears and pitchforks as congregated near the gate, with faces full of anxiety and fear. After a group of scoundrels from the auxiliaries took not only the supplies they needed for winter but also the blacksmith's daughter for their own sick entertainment. More and more villagers with curiosity and concern etched deeply on their faces flooded to the gate. The word of the strangers with metal carriages spread like wildfire through Twine Ward. Amidst the growing crowd, the village head, Sophin, made his way to the front with his son, Afton, following closely behind. The man was a figure of resilience hardened by years of service to both the Seraphic Empire and the local lord. Sophin liked to consider himself a warrior of some merit, and he stood tall even in his older years. His hands gripped an all-metal partisan spear as its surface gleamed in the morning light. His eyes were sharp and discerning while he scanned the landscape, trying to spot more of these newcomers. His son, Afton, bore a striking resemblance to his father. His hands were steady as he notched a large arrow in his enchanted bow made of the antlers of an ixtal, a massive druidic deer that had bark for skin and branches for antlers. The weapon was a family heirloom whispered to have been blessed by the spirits of the druids' timber themselves. The morning light caught the bow's intricate carvings, casting patterns that danced upon the stone walls of Twine Ward. "These ain't like any bandits or soldiers I've seen afore," Afton remarked, his voice carrying the heavy accent of their land. "They're different." Sophin nodded in agreement as he covered his brow with one hand to get a better look at the approaching band. "Aye, lad. Perhaps they're the ones that felled that wyvern the other night," he mused, his voice resonating with a mix of caution and intrigue. "But let's not lower our guard just yet. Could be they're just another lot lookin' fair trouble." As the defenders of Twine Ward watched, the strangers maneuvered their metallic, beastless, carriages into positions that drew a deep frown on Sophin's seasoned face. The precision with which they positioned themselves was not lost on him, it was a tactic reminiscent of competent commanders placing siege engines before a battle. "Look at 'em, movin' like they be layin' a siege," Sophin muttered under his breath, his grip on his partisan tightening. "They be already out of arrow range, but they placened themselves where a mage would find it hard to reach and coverin' their flanks." Afton gave his father a nervous glance, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "There's only a few of 'em," he observed, trying to find some reassurance in their numbers. "And they don't look so tough." Turning to his son, Sophin's face hardened. His boy was as hard-headed as he was self-absorbed, always quick to boast of his prowess. "Afton, remember, there were only a few of them auxiliary folks before they came out of nowhere and took Danu's girls, and our supplies," Sophin cautioned, his tone grave. "There's a lot more to outside of them walls than what ye can see." A scoff left Afton's mouth as he waved away at the warning. "Yeah, but them good-for-nothings had a wyvern. I probably coulda took Gladeheart," he said, referring to his bow, "and took it out, but I ain't want the village to be destroyed." Sophin glowered at his son for a moment, the frustration evident on his face. "Afton, don't be a fool," he sighed deeply. "Just 'cause you took down a whelping and ixtal, that ain't mean you can kill a full-fledged wyvern." A discontented grunt left Afton's mouth as he gave his father the side eye. Afton had always harbored a vastly different opinion compared to his old man, especially when it came to assessing his own capabilities and the weight of their ancestral legacy. The topic of his potential and prowess had been a recurring theme in their conversations, a topic that Afton felt he had more insight into than anyone else, including Sophin. After all, it was their powerful grandfather who had chosen him, not his father, to inherit the wondrous Bow Gladeheart. This choice, in Afton's mind, was a clear testament to his inherent strength and destiny to rise above ordinary expectations. But this was an argument Afton and Sofan had rehashed time and again, and each time it went nowhere. Afton perceived his father's caution as little more than projections of his own insecurities and perhaps even jealousy. The old man had been angry that Uncle Prado had left it in Afton's care after passing. So, as Sofan expressed his concerns about the mysterious newcomers and their potentially hidden strength, Afton couldn't help but roll his eyes. As he held onto his enchanted bow, each word seemed to go in one ear and out the other. Gladeheart and his skill alone was more than enough to handle any threat, be it from man or beast. In his heart, Afton believed that his overcautious father would be the downfall of this village one day. And that was a fate he wasn't willing to partake in. For Afton's destiny was to be a hero of legend, not merely another villager living in squalor, hunting small game or the occasional deer. Recognizing the familiar stubborn set of his son's jaw, Sofan heaved a weary sigh. He knew all too well the futility of trying to pierce the armor of Afton's self-assuredness with words alone. Just keep your eyes sharp and Gladeheart ready, Sofan sighed, choosing to drop the argument as a lone figure started to approach. I ain't one to be taken by surprise. Afton heaved a derisive sigh and looked at his father as if the man had gone completely senile. The figure approaching was unmistakably a woman, and not just any woman, but Danu's daughter, Risa. For a fleeting moment, Afton entertained the thought that perhaps age had finally taken its toll, and this minor slip-up only served to reinforce Afton's belief that he was the rightful wielder of Gladeheart. Without a word, Afton started to climb down the wall to meet the poor woman waddling forward. Sofan, on the other hand, spun around in a mix of frustration and anger. What the hell are you doing? Get back on the damned wall, foolish boy, he barked. Not even bothering to answer or even acknowledge his father, Afton continued to climb down until he landed on the ground with a thud. If he can't see who it is, then that ain't my problem, he finally answered back with a voice laced with what felt like disdain. I ain't gonna listen to some blind old bat. As the stubborn young man walked off, Sofan stood fuming atop the wall, clutching the shaft of his spear tightly. He knew that arguing whenever Afton had made up his mind, nothing could dissuade him, and any attempt to reason with the young man was pointless. Instead, Sofan decided it would be best to join his son at the gate. Even though the plan was idiotic, committing to a bad plan was better than no plan. He scanned the horizon one more time for signs of any other potential threats besides the strangers and their carriages, before leaping off the wall himself and chasing after Afton. While he jogged towards the gate, Sofan's eyes caught the sight of several villagers gathering around, trying to get a better view through the gaps in the walls. The tension and curiosity were so thick in the air that one could taste it, given the recent events that had plagued Twine Ward. And when he walked past the gate, the sight that greeted Sofan softened the hard edges of worry that had settled around his heart. An even larger group had formed, circling around Danu, who was hugging his daughter, Risa, tightly. Tears were streaming down his face as spun her around in his arms, weeping unabashedly. Risa. I'm so sorry, my baby. I shoulda just went at him. Even if it meant dying, I shoulda protected you. Danu sobbed, his voice cracking with emotion. Oh God, I didn't think. I never thought I'd see you back alive. Risa was also weeping as she returned her father's hug. She buried her face into his shoulder, overwhelmed with relief of being back home. Pa, it's okay, Pa. She choked out as she squeezed, you couldn't have done nothing. There were too many, and they had that monster with them. But I should have tried. I should have done something, Danu continued, his apologies tumbling out one after another. Pa, stop, Risa insisted softly, her hands cupping his tear-streaked face, urging him to look at her. I'm here now. I'm alive, that's all that matters, okay? Good to have you back, Afton finally spoke up, his voice carrying a mix of relief and a lingering bitterness. I should have done something too. But. His father cut him off sharply, if we'd done anything, that wyvern would have torched the entire village. Sofan's voice was laden with a heavy mix of frustration and a hint of fear at the memory of the threat they had faced. We couldn't risk it. Not for everyone. Afton's expression soured further, his earlier bitterness turning into outright anger. So, we just sacrifice a girl to a group of savages, he spat out, his voice rising with each word. Capitulatin' to those bandits does nothing but encourage 'em. And when does it stop, huh? When they find Rice's body? Goliath's daughter next? Would ye have been satisfied if we gave them bandits all the women in the village to force themselves onto and murder before ye got the idea that resistin' is a better option? The village chief and his son glared at each other with an intensity that those around them thought the two were going to come to blows. It was clear they stood on opposite ends of a divide too wide to bridge with words alone as their vastly different worldviews clashed heavily. Before the argument could escalate further, Rice's voice, soft yet firm, cut through the tension. Please, I don't want any y'all getting hurt over me. So, please don't fight, I just want to go home to Ma, she pleaded, her eyes moving between her Sophin and Afton. It ain't worth it. Her words seemed to douse the flames of anger, at least momentarily. Sophin and Afton reluctantly turned their attention back to her even though they gave each other a scalding side-eye. Donna's lil girl is right, Sophin finally conceded, his voice losing some of its earlier heat. We got bigger problems than our own, squabbles. He said bitterly as he turned his annoyed gaze to the 2-3 strangers standing patiently in the distance. How'd you get back any who's? Them strangers help ya? Gently brought down to her feet by her father, Risa adjusted her ripped clothing and nodded. A haunted look flashed across her face as she recounted her harrowing experience. When one of them soldiers had their way with these strangers. She paused, swallowing hard, the trauma evident in her quivering voice. They swept through the camp like specters of death, killing any and all who dared oppose them with a swiftness I've only heard of in one of those scary stories Nana would tell me as a youngin'. Risa glanced over her shoulder and saw the two strangely dressed men standing nonchalantly with their weird weapons and shields. They helped me, tended to my cuts and bruises, gave me some food and water before a skin if I'd help them talk with y'all. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. They're looking to trade for supplies, a roof over their head, and a reward if we could muster one. Rice's eyes darted between the villagers gathered around, seeking understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, for bringing these ominous strangers to their doorstep. Afton's expression softened as he listened to Risa. The bitterness and anger momentarily subsided over to the awaiting outsiders and their mysterious intervention. We should probably hear him out, he said, glancing at his father, expecting another argument. But instead, he found his father deep in thought as he stared hard at the newcomers. We ain't got much choice. Sophin nodded, his gaze still fixed on the strangers at the edge of their land. I've heard tales from merchants passin' through, he began, his voice carrying the weight of his years and the wisdom that came with it. We be at war. The Empire's been fightin' with some strange folk and got their teeth kicked in. If these be those damned invaders, and they can swat a wyvern out the sky like it were no more'n an annoyin' gnat, then we'd be fools not to grant 'em audience. Listening to his father, Afton couldn't help but frown. The wording his father used didn't sit with him quite as well as he liked. After all, the people who were meant to protect them from invaders and bandits had turned to savagery themselves, while these strangers had stepped in to help. Sure, they want a reward, Afton muttered, his eyes narrowing. But who wouldn't, after doing all that? These auxiliary bastards never done half as much for us. Don't argue with me on this, boy. Sophin barked sharply at his son and braced for the challenge. However, instead of retorting with the usual defiance, Afton held his father's gaze for a moment longer, then simply nodded. The action took Sophin by surprise. Afton had always been headstrong, fueled by a fervent belief in his own judgments, especially after inheriting Gladeheart from his brother. But his son, for once in half a decade, chose another path. What he didn't know was Afton's gut told him these strangers indeed had ulterior motives. However, he felt that these motives were not particularly malicious. At least the malice wasn't towards them. His father might hark on about his unwise and foolish ways, but Afton decided it was time to let things play out to see how his father's methods would take things. Taken aback by the sudden and unexpected shift in Afton's demeanor, left Sophin somewhat speechless. Clearing his throat, Sophin regained his composure and turned his attention to Risa and her father, Danu. Get out of here and go on home, the village chief said with a hard look in his eye. I'll take care of them outsiders. Still overcome with emotion, Danu, the blacksmith, managed a nod of gratitude before he and Risa slowly made their way through the villagers as they made way. The folk of Twineward whispered among themselves, hushed voices full of curiosity and concern echoing as Sophin squared his shoulders, preparing to act as their delegate again. And now that he got a good look at them, the strangers stood there like eerily. Their silhouettes seemed to be broken up by whatever in the hells they were wearing, and their equipment was the likes of which Sofan nor anyone in Twine Ward had ever laid eyes on, carrying strange weapons that Stofan couldn't identify for the life of him. Even their shields seemed to be made of materials on materials, foregoing the traditional wood or metal and opting for something else entirely. Must be damned mages, Sofan muttered to himself, before turning to his son with a stern look. Stay here. No, Afton retorted instantly in a bored and unimpressed tone. Sofan's head snapped towards his son, ready to unleash a torrent of a lecture, but Afton cut him off. If they wanted to start killin' us, they wouldn't bother trickin' some boondock village head out to murder him. Plus, weren't you going to give Donna leadership if you passed? The words hung between them, charged with Afton's challenge. With a mouth flapping like a fish, Sofan struggled to find a response. His son was just too much at times. With a heavy sigh, he pinched the bridge of his nose, shook his head, and moved on. He had neither the time nor the patience to bother with another asinine argument. As they made their way toward the waiting strangers, Sofan's mind started to race. These folk. They were unlike anything the village had ever encountered before. He had dealt with and even killed a mage before, but the way these people carried themselves. It was alien. To Sofan, they were an omen of change, and as a servant of the Empire, it was a change for the worse. Afton took a reluctant step back and allowed his father to lead as they approached the two outsiders. The strangers' reaction was immediate and defensive. They subtly reoriented their shields toward them and adjusted the angle of their weird weapons so they were oriented toward him and his father. Hail, strangers! Sofan called out, his voice firm yet cautious. He noted their defensive posture and the way they aimed their odd weapons in his direction. Wishing to avoid any misunderstandings, especially considering these men had aided Risa, Sofan came to a halt and planted his spear into the ground. Raising his hands to show he meant no harm, he then proceeded to walk forward with deliberate, measured steps. As he drew closer, Sofan observed that these were indeed men, albeit unlike any he had encountered. One of them was pale, with the clean-shaven appearance of a noble and piercing blue eyes that seemed to scrutinize everything around him. The other sported a short beard and a much darker tan tone, reminiscent of the people from the southwestern island states, known for their mercenary armies and trade. Sofan cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. I am Sofan, head of Twine Ward. We owe ye thanks for the return of our blacksmith's daughter. His gaze shifted between the two, trying to gauge their reaction. Ye be far from any land I know. What brings you to Twine Ward? The one with the tanned skin responded, his voice carrying an accent unfamiliar to Sofan. We bring refugees from a hamlet a few hours or, he paused, calculating the travel time in a manner they might understand, then continued, about half a day's travel from here. Soldiers, like the ones that took the girl, attacked them and razed their homes to the ground. Instinctively, Sofan looked back at Afton with eyes that conveyed skepticism towards the tale these outsiders wove. Afton's face, however, was expressionless, almost as if he found nothing in the stranger's words to be surprising. They had been virtually attacked as well, after all. The tanned man elaborated further, we're currently looking for shelter, maybe some trade, and directions. Those soldiers have left many without a family and all of them without homes, so we've taken it upon ourselves to get them to some kind of safety before continuing on our journey. That be very noble of ye, stranger, Sofan responded, looking past the outsiders to see a group of huddled peasants watching their conversation expectantly. Every single one of them looked weary and frightened yet clinging to a fragile thread of hope. Not unlike his own, these were people caught in the turmoil of a world they had little control over. It was a compelling bit of evidence supporting the story they told. Ye have come at a difficult time, Sofan said, his voice firm and unwilling to allow a horde of people into his village in these trying times. While Twine Ward usually gives whatever aid we can, we ain't got much after dealing with our own attacks. The tanned man nodded in understanding before gesturing and beckoning to a select few from the group of refugees. Hopefully, we can change your mind. We even have a few representatives that claim to know you, he stated as the selected few shuffled forward. Sofan's gaze intensified, scanning the faces until recognition dawned upon him. Among them, two faces stood out, faces he knew well, but now marred by the harrowing experiences they must have endured. Gone was the vibrancy and gentleness of life that Sofan remembered, in its place was a haunting expression that spoke volumes of the horrors they had faced. And as they opened their mouth to speak of their experiences, any chance turning away these refugees and avoiding these strangers disappeared. Even if he didn't like it, or it lead to their demise, Twine Ward's core tenet was never to turn away those from a sister village. Elijah was hunched over, resting his head on his arms as he watched a veritable horde of villagers help the refugees through the gate. Men and women, young and old, rallied together in a wholesome display of solidarity and compassion. At least it should have been. Sure, the people of this were extending their hands in hospitality, pulling together resources to support these refugees, but Elijah couldn't help but feel a twinge of skepticism. His mind flashed back to his experience during Hurricane Katrina, where the outpouring of aid and support often came with strings attached. For every warm bowl of soup provided, there seemed to be an expectation, a debt incurred, never official or even verbally spoken, but still palpably present. It was a harsh reminder that in the world he came from, assistance rarely came without conditions. In the wake of the disaster, communities often rallied together, but the initial surge of goodwill could sometimes morph into resentment or expectation of repayment once the immediate crisis faded. Elijah wondered if this village would also eventually come to view these refugees not just as victims in need, but as debts to be repaid or even new assets to exploit. After all, resources were finite, and adding new mouths to feed, especially in this quasi-medieval setting where scarcity was a constant threat, could strain even the most generous community's goodwill. Moreover, Elijah was uncertain about this world's stance on the vulnerable, particularly women and children. From what he'd seen so far, the impression he got wasn't exactly what one would call positive. If one went by Earth's historical context, he could assume their futures were pretty bleak, regardless of what Coleman and the rest of the team wanted to do. Women and children often bore the brunt of societal upheavals and were usually forced by coercion or debt into more intimate professions. Elijah would like to detach himself from the situation, dust off his hands, and say this just wasn't their problem. However, a nagging sense in the back of his mind told him Coleman wouldn't stand for such a Machiavellian approach or whatever buzzword he'd think up at the time. However, Elijah liked to think of himself as a pragmatist or a realist. Each decision had pros and cons, benefits, and demerits that could have very lethal consequences. The question then became, what were they going to do with these refugees? Where would they go now? Where would they sleep? How would they eat? How would all of this be financed? And, most important of all, how could they manage to do all of this while still being able to operate and continue their primary objective? Everyone loved getting caught up in the ideals and morality. They never stopped to ask if there was a place and time for any of that. It's one thing to be presented with a problem like having a group of vulnerable people with the means and ends to do something about it, but they had neither. The ODA was far behind enemy lines, using minimal resources and very minimal personnel with little to no hopes of escape should they be compromised. A groan of frustration left Elijah's mouth as he dug deeper and deeper, using every ounce of his mind to find a way to come out on top. He needed to come up with some kind of win, or else they were unimaginably fucked. The immediate logistical challenges of shelter, food, and not getting their throats slit at night were enough of an issue. But when it came to the longer-term questions of operational security, sustainability, and execution of their mission were even more complex. Bro, what the hell, Elijah whined as he lethargically rubbed his eyes. Turning his eyes to his team, Elijah watched as Lister and Bennett were off poking at the wyvern's corpse, pretending to pull security, while Quan and Schwartz pushed a poorly maintained cart. The entire ODA, save for him and a few others, were off mingling with the locals or keeping themselves busy in some fashion. Even his team leader, Coleman, was off speaking with the village head and his son, acting as a diplomatic representative. A sudden yank of his hair finally brought Elijah out of his brooding and caused him to rear up to his full height in the turret finally. "What is upsetting my human?" she barked cheekily. "Human, inform your master why you are upset, and I shall fix it." "Fuckin'." Elijah winced as he glared up at the fairy who had both feet planted on his forehead, holding onto two fists full of hair to keep her anchored as she leaned forward. "Can you maybe not do that?" he sneered. Unfazed by Elijah's discomfort, Yana simply fluttered her wings in what could only be described as a fairy's equivalent of a shrug. "But I must know," she insisted, her voice a mix of genuine concern and mischievous curiosity. "How else can I assist my human if he does not share his troubles? Is it the stupid elf? Is it your incessant need to constantly move around? Is it the stupid dirty mortals and their stupid dirty huts?" Yana started to shotgun off potential reasons while swinging side to side, still pulling at his hair. "Should I zap him?" Already sick of her shit, Elijah shot his hand to snatch the little menace off his head, but he found that Yana was infinitely faster. The fairy zipped up into the sky with a triumphant laugh. Glaring up at her, Elijah barked, "Yana, you can't just zap dudes all willy-nilly. We're trying to keep a low profile here and not create problems unnecessarily." He narrowed his eyes and glared at his patron. "We need to find the right people to zap, and the right people to turn to our side." Yana stuck her tongue out at her human before snapping her head to the side in a harumph, clearly not taking any of his shenanigans. Meanwhile, Elijah grumbled to himself before leaning against the back of the turret and heaving a kind of deep and heavy sigh that only the kind people who were at the end of their ropes made. As the last group of refugees finally made their way inside, Elijah wondered what in hell he was going to do with this mess. Completely stumped, he decided to take a shot and ask his cosmic hitchhiker for any ounce of wisdom. Looking up, Elijah watched as Yana continued to hover above him with an impish grin. "You had worshippers or some shit," Elijah randomly blurted out, giving her an exhausted look. "What do you think we should do with this shit show? What do you think I should do with these people to make it easier to move around without babysitting them? First of all, rude." Yana shot back with her hands on her hips as she twirled around. "I have worshippers. Not had." She corrected but paused for a moment as she actually considered the question. "Well, mortal problems require mortal solutions," the goddess finally said, landing on the edge of the mounted heavy machine gun's barrel, swinging her feet in a carefree manner. "But, if you ask this great one, then this great one's suggestion is just to take over the village." Elijah's initial reaction was an instinctive scoff as he threw up his hands. "Yeah, no. That's not an option. I can't just take over some bumfuck village," and he began to dismiss the fairy's outlandish suggestion, already regretting he had even bothered to ask this psychopath's opinion. However, mid-retort, Elijah froze. His mind raced a mile a minute, and his brows furrowed as the dots started to connect. This wasn't a bad idea. There were some major flaws and pitfalls he'd had to work out, like that act. There was some obvious contention the village head had for the ODA team and the refugees, but that could be worked out. The majority of the villagers were vastly more accommodating and accepting than their leader, especially after Elijah and the team returned the girl. He could leverage that goodwill. Turning the idea over in his mind, Elijah recognized the opportunity lying beneath the surface of Yana's seemingly absurd suggestion. If they could position themselves as protectors, or if need be, take over the leadership position entirely. This would not only secure the innumerable special operations teams a base of operations, but also provide some kind of support for the local population since they were still relatively close to the rift. This could facilitate their primary mission, provide a measure of safety, and give them a pool of local resources to draw upon. A twinkle shone in Elijah's eye as his thoughts went back to that blacksmith's daughter. The genuine gratitude and goodwill they had earned for returning her could be the perfect foundation to build on. They just had to do something about this grabby, middle-aged man who seemed to stare at them suspiciously. Elijah's gaze then drifted over to Coleman and the village head, having a back-and-forth. "Hey, Azaleen," Elijah called out, hoping for some insight from a local or at least to bounce some ideas off of her. However, there was no response. He tried again, a bit louder this time. "Azaleen?" Still, nothing. Confused, Elijah looked down to find Azaleen with her head lolling to the side, her mouth agape, and a large flow of drool flowing down her face as she found the deep embrace of sleep. Irritated and somewhat amused at the sight, Elijah gave her shoulder a rough kick. "Hey, Az. Wake up, goddammit," he barked. Azaleen's reaction was immediate. She flailed around violently, nearly tumbling out of the vehicle before she caught herself. She whipped her head towards Elijah and shot him a look that could curdle milk. "What?" she snarled, clearly not appreciative of being roused in such a manner. "What the hell do you want, you goddamned asshole?" An amused and mischievous look spread across Elijah's face as he huffed continuously in amusement. "Hey, well. I got some questions I need to ask you." A bitter look formed on Azaleen's face as she swatted away Elijah's boot in outrage. "Why the hell would I answer anything you ask after that?" she barked, balling her hand into a fist. Elijah, unfazed and perhaps a bit emboldened by her reaction, looked up at Yana with exaggerated, mock innocence and said in a childish voice as if he were tattling on Azaleen, "Yana, she's not helping me." Yana's tiny head suddenly popped into the turret, looking down at Azaleen with an annoyed and incredulous expression. "Ha," she exclaimed, clearly taken aback by the scene unfolding below her. Guh, Azaleen flinched as her jaw tightened and her fierce look wavered. For a moment she had completely forgotten about the existence of this damned fae and was subsequently caught off guard. But just as Yana was about to let loose a few choice words of her own, Azaleen shouted out first with a voice laced with exasperation, "Fine, fine, fine. What in the hells are your questions?" A mischievous and pompous grin was spread across Elijah's face when he clapped his hands together. "Wonderful," he shouted in glee before clearing his throat. "All right, now that I've got your attention. I've been thinking," his finger danced together as his expression turned contemplative. "So we've got these refugees and this village, right? And Sue. I may have found an opportunity here, but it's delicate." Azaleen placed a hand to head and started rubbing it to assuage the headache away that was forming. She was close to just turning around and chucking the nearest object at the man, but the omnipresent glare of his patron prevented her from taking any action. "As our local expert, what is your take on how to, let's say," Elijah paused for a moment, trying to figure out the right word in this strange language to express what he was trying to achieve. "Take over this village in a less than hostile way." Staring at the man as if he was stupid, Azaleen remained quiet for a few long moments before responding with a mixture of disbelief and sarcasm, "Just say you're taking over." She narrowed her eyes and lightly shook her head as if to say that this was the most obvious solution. Continuing with a tone of incredulity, she added, "And if they resist, you kill the village head and anyone else who says otherwise." "What kind of stupid question is that?" "No, no, no. Just, no." Elijah pressed both hands to the bridge of his nose before throwing his head back slightly. "I'm not trying to kill them or force them. I'm trying to His hands started rolling as he tried to think of the words. "Coerce? No. Pressure? No. Manipulate?" He then snapped his fingers and pointed at Azaleen before continuing, "Manipulate. I'm trying to manipulate them into listening to us, instead of their leader." The annoyed look on Azaleen's face softened a bit as she crossed her arms and tapped her finger on her bicep. I think I know what you're trying to get at, but," she hummed in interest as she began to collect her thoughts before speaking. "I haven't been a serf or a peasant since I was a child, so I'm not overly familiar with their current wants and needs," she confessed. "However, I have experience with taking over villages abandoned by their lords when I was a shield maiden. As far as I know, you've already done quite a bit by saving and returning one of their own. But, these refugees are going to quickly weigh on them and become a burden if left as is." Elijah started to stroke his beard thoughtfully as he listened. The issue of the refugees was indeed pressing, and their presence could potentially strain their relationship with the villagers if not handled correctly. The main issues were going to be food and shelter, and seeing that the majority of the survivors were women and children, they couldn't exactly be put to manual labor like military-aged men. "They'll eventually have to be relocated," Azaleen concluded with a sigh, but her eyes sharpened as she looked over to the eastern horizon. "However, there's quite a sizable town not too far away from here. Maybe you could get a trade caravan going under your protection. This village is out in the middle of nowhere, so any chance they could get an armed escort, they'll jump at it." That bit of information seemed to light up Elijah's face. Okay. He nearly shouted as he looked over at Coleman, who was finally making his way over. "We could do a few favors, help around with the villagers, and ingratiate ourselves to them. If the village chief or whatever doesn't like us, he'll still be undermined by our favorable outlook, and then we could work on turning them against him," Elijah mused, his mind racing with possibilities. "And if all else fails, you could," Azaleen smiled evilly and slid her hand across her throat, "do some leadership changes behind the scenes during the caravan escort." Just as Elijah and Azaleen were getting into the meat of their nefarious plotting, Coleman arrived, catching the tail end of their cackling madness. The look on his face was one of disgust as he surveyed the scene before him. Elijah, still brimming with the glee of their scheming, barely noticed Coleman's approach until it was too late. "Great, now there's two of them," Coleman muttered under his breath, his gaze shifting between Elijah and Azaleen. The disdain was palpable in his voice as he spoke up, "Do I even want to know?" "Probably not," the two troublemakers said at the same time. "Rivka." A voice called out in the periphery of Rivka's consciousness. But the words quickly disappeared as quickly as they came, as deafening and horrifying snaps and hisses of projectiles resounded all around him. Rivka found himself running through what seemed like an endless field of capon grass as he ran for his life. Rivka's heart pounded in his chest wildly as terror gripped his mind. He cursed himself repeatedly, regretting trying to play it smart and join the auxiliaries for some valuable experience before venturing into the independent and treacherous world of being a freelancer. Stupid, 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 he screamed between labored breaths, the reality of his situation crashing down on him with every step he took through the dense grass that seemed to grip around his legs as if trying to slow him down. The sounds of the strange and terrifying weapons pursued him relentlessly. Each snap and hiss was a promise of death if he dared to slow his pace. The projectiles struck the ground closer and closer, throwing up clumps of earth and snapping thick blades of grass with each impact. The idea that just moments ago, he had been considering this stint with the auxiliaries as a mere stepping stone in his career seemed laughably naive now. Rivka, wake up. The voice called again, more urgently this time. It was a familiar voice, one that he recognized even in his panicked state. But the grip of fear was strong, and he struggled to break free from the terror's unyielding hold. With burning lungs, Rivka pushed his legs to the limit as he made his flight. Rivka's mind raced, searching desperately for a plan, any plan, to escape this nightmare. He had always prided himself on his ability to think on his feet, but he found himself in a seemingly impossible position. Desperation started to set in as Rivka realized just how hopeless his situation was. He was no proper mage with formal training, adorned with an arsenal of powerful spells at his disposal. No, he was merely some random lucky idiot who had learned to read at an early age and had been even luckier to get his hands on a beginner's spellbook. That modest achievement, which had once filled him with pride, now seemed insignificant in the face of the overwhelming force pursuing him. He knew for a fact that he was outclassed in every conceivable way by these unknown beings, and his end seemed that it wasn't just a possibility but an inevitability. The advanced magic or, whatever it was that his pursuers wielded, was like nothing he had ever encountered or read about. Each burst of cacophonous barking from their strange weapons was a stark reminder of his impending doom. And just as this grim acceptance settled over him, a misstep sealed his fate. The thick tendrils of the capon grass finally ensnared him. With a sudden jerk, his legs were yanked back by the usually inert crop, sending him face-first into the unforgiving earth below. An involuntary oof escaped his lips as he made contact, the ground knocking the breath from his lungs. Dazed and confused as to why inanimate grass would usually trap him, Rivka's eyes went wide with fear as the sound of two heavy thunks resounded just behind him. Turning around, he found two fist-sized orbs slowly rolling his way. A sense of dread and horror filled him as Rivka opened his mouth to scream, but before a sound could come out, a thundering smack and searing hot pain coursed through his face. "Wake up, you damned feathered idiot." Talarian sneered as Rivka shot up, holding his face with panicked eyes. Rivka's face spun around wildly, trying to make sense of his surroundings as his mind reeled from the sudden shift in reality. The last thing he remembered was the terrifying pursuit through the grass, but now he found himself bouncing rhythmically in the back of a carriage. The jostling was disorienting, and for a moment, he could not reconcile how he'd gone from a flight for his life to this. Talarian's glare was sharp as he let out an exasperated sigh. "We're here," Talarian said, nonchalantly gesturing ahead. Following the direction of Talarian's hand, Rivka gazed out of the carriage to see a town built on top of a hill unfolding before them. It was almost impossibly picturesque, with quaint stone houses adorned with creeping vines and blooming flowers. The rooftops were a blend of earthy tones, and the streets were filled with the hustle and bustle of daily life, yet a tranquil harmony seemed to permeate the air. For a moment, Rivka simply sat there, taking it all in before a deep and heavy sigh left his mouth. They finally arrived at the town of Glensworth, and hopefully, the events leading up to this point would turn into a distant nightmare. However, Rivka knew trying to forget the horrors of how the Otherworlders waged war would be impossible, but the town's allure did a lot to soothe his frayed nerves. "Thank the gods," Rivka finally muttered out after flopping back down into the bed of the carriage. As the lines of stress dissipated on Rivka's delicate features, Talarian couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Yes, thank the gods," Talarian shouted, gesturing grandly to the sky as they rumbled through the gates of Glensworth. "Because it was the gods that dragged your sorry dehydrated ass across endless fields of garbage." Talarian retorted sarcastically, with a dry chuckle. Rivka looked up at him with an impish smile creeping onto his lips. "I suppose I owe you a word of thanks." He shot back as his arms went behind his head and his eyes closed. "I would also suppose we could consider ourselves even since I dragged you out of that nightmare in the fort." Talarian huffed in feigned annoyance as he leaned against the wall and waved off Rivka's remark with a wave of his hand. Yeah, whatever. I'm just glad we're away from those damn demons. He continued with audible relief in his voice. It almost felt like we were being chased. Right? It was as if those otherworldly hellspawns were unsatisfied with the fact they hadn't struck down every soul in that damnable place and dedicated themselves to finishing the job, Rivka said in disgust as he let out an exhausted sigh. Flipping his eyes over his shoulder and looking at the hilltop covered in buildings, Rivka seemed to murmur to himself rather than to Talarian. But what's next? We find a way to make ourselves some money here and start gathering supplies, Talarian replied, leaning forward, his voice low and conspiratorial. We have skills, and this town could use someone of our talents. We hoard as much crap as we can and then hightail it to Alden Shore. Bringing his hand to his smooth chin, Rivka considered Talarian's words with a smirk. He hummed in interest as he thought this could be another opportunity to gain some experience as a newly budding freelancer. I like the sound of that. Plus, we should have some time to relax and spread our wings out before those things show up again. Yeah, we'll lay low, gather what we can, and prepare for the road ahead, Talarian agreed, his eyes scanning the marketplace's vibrant stalls and chattering townsfolk. I doubt they'll attack somewhere so populated. Rivka chuckled lightly and sat up once more, allowing the tension to finally seep out of his shoulders as he watched a group of children chasing each other around a fountain. The darkness of light loomed over Alden Shore as Varasha glowered hatefully at the reports she was handed by her retainers and war council. The Seraph Durgonkin's snout clenched tighter with each word she read, her draconic pupils narrowing into slits as she digested the gravity of the information laid out before her. The magically imbued parchment crackled under the tension of her grip, the spell protecting it threatening to shatter. For her, as a Duchess of the Empire, these were not just words, they were a harbinger of potential doom, a shadowed path that could lead to ruin if she tread carelessly. She could usually dismiss reports of skirmishes and minor losses with a cold, calculated detachment, but not now. Now, every syllable bore weight. Every stroke of ink could be the difference between life and death. Varasha was no stranger to the deadly dance of power, but this was different. At first, Varasha thought her supposed emperor had ever so carefully placed her in a position to blunt the main thrust of the Otherworlders in a bid to defame and discredit her. But on closer inspection and verification of the Otherworlders' capabilities, it was all too apparent he was trying to kill her. When she finally spoke, her voice was a lethal whisper that cut through the tense air of the chamber. Theraval, she addressed one of her generals, a dark elven man. They're everywhere like a plague, aren't they? She asked as superheated primal fire leaked from her snout and snarling maw. Theraval's dark eyes darted away, his usual composed demeanor faltering under her intense gaze. Why yes, mistress, he admitted with a deep and respectful bow. These Otherworlders, they strike swiftly and fade into the night, leaving turmoil in their wake. Varasha's tail lashed out, sweeping a stack of maps from the table in a display of frustration. Everywhere we believe ourselves secure, they prove us wrong, she hissed, the fire within her threatening to burst forth. Command centers compromised, supply lines in disarray, our commanders fall one by one to their invisible blades. Even the troops, our soldiers, now sleep with one eye open, fearing the night's embrace. Theraval's hand clenched at his side, his own frustration mirroring his queen's. Their methods are not too dissimilar to the methods of the Towery, he conceded, struggling to maintain his composure as his eyes darted to the dark gray-skinned Towery savage in the corner of the chambers. And the fear they sow is potent among the other lord's men, mistress. The fury within Varasha only seemed to grow after hearing Theraval's words. It was a smoldering anger that seemed to heat the very air around her and cause her counsel to flinch as more flames erupted from her mouth and nostrils. Damn you, Varian. She cursed through gritted teeth, the name of the Emperor searing the room with its bitterness. I hope the hells take you to the deepest, coldest pit they can find and lock you away for all eternity. The room fell into an uneasy silence, her council and retainers exchanging nervous glances, not daring to utter a word. To speak out during such a display of wrath was to risk a fiery end. Several long, agonizing minutes passed as Varasha sat upon her throne. Her head rested lightly in one hand as her fingers covered her eyes as if to shield her from the world's treachery. Her chest heaved with each breath, the embers of her anger glowing hot beneath her feathers. Finally, with a deep, controlled inhale, the Duchess composed herself, and the flames subsided. She realized every minute, every second counted, and she could not afford to brood. Not now, not when every move could lead to her demise. I want every dragon and every wyvern accounted for, she commanded with an authoritative and measured tone. I want every man or beast who is even capable of even feeling mana to be put under my command. Suddenly, Varasha stood up and strode toward the table where a detailed magical projection of the lands lay displayed. The room balked at her order, and a human commander, garbed in the regal uniform of his rank, dared to speak, his voice a mixture of caution and concern. Mistress, the lords and ladies of the war group would never. Then kill them. Varasha's shout was a shockwave that rattled the chamber, her draconic fury causing a puff of flames to burst forth and send the human reeling from the intense heat and cringe. The room was plunged into a frightened silence, each member of the council fully aware of the stakes. Varasha's eyes, now shimmering with an inner fire, swept across the faces of her advisors, her generals, her retainers, each one avoiding her gaze, knowing full well she was completely serious. She leaned over the projection, her face piercing a mountain and her claws clamping down on the representation of the rift. We are at war. She growled fiercely. And war requires discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. If the lords and ladies continue to play their petty games of power and refuse to see the threat these otherworlders pose, if they cannot unite under one banner for the sake of our very existence, then they are no better than traitors. Varasha's voice thundered through the chamber, resonating with the authority of a commander preparing for an all-out siege. Be they peasant or count, if any refuse to fall in line under a unified command, then they are to be slain on the spot. Her eyes scanned the room, capturing the expressions of shock and fear on every face present. The gravity of her command hung heavy in the air, there was not a hint of doublespeak or sarcasm in the dragoness's words. Theraval, Morith, Irend, Silver, you four are to bring with you all of my greatest mages and warriors at first light and see to it they're all brought in line, Varasha continued, her voice as cold and hard as the stone walls surrounding them. You have my full authority as Duchess to execute any who refuse, political blowback be damned. If I must slaughter half of the nobility and become an enemy of every house, then so be it. If I am to be co-signed to my grave by this inbred cur of an emperor, she bellowed, the fire in her belly igniting once more, sending waves of heat throughout the room, then I shall do so kicking and screaming, dragging as many of those fop bastards and hellspawned otherworlders with me. Shall I start conscripting the local population and freelancers, mistress? Morvelin, the human commander, asked as he bowed deeply. Kicking the slag clumped on the stone floor to the side and out of the way, Varasha's gaze never left the magical projection that illuminated the chamber with an ethereal glow. Her snout twisted in disgust at the suggestion, no, the mundane will be useless in this fight, and the cell's words are too unreliable. I need discipline and obedience, not warm bodies. She sneered. The lords and ladies brought plenty enough fodder to blunt whatever those creatures will throw at us initially. As the Duchess spread her taloned hands on the table, she leaned forward so her imposing figure loomed even larger over the map. Her eyes, now aflame with a predatory intensity, were fixed on the glowing representation of the rift. We must treat their aerial threat as if it far exceeds those reported from the initial expedition, she declared, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a knife. We must become clever and vicious. The darkness of her feathers seemed to absorb the light around her, casting her in a silhouette that was both majestic and terrifying. Her advisors were a collection of some of the most formidable minds and warriors in the empire, and they all stood frozen. The mere notion of losing air superiority was unthinkable, yet Varasha's implications were clear, they needed to prepare for the worst. The concept of merely contested airspace was unsettling enough, but to be wholly outmatched was a scenario they hadn't dared to contemplate. Due to our Emperor's most gracious allocation of qualified personnel, beasts, and dragons, we must adopt a more asymmetrical approach, Varasha continued, her voice turned more thoughtful as her eyes darted across the map, focusing on the vast, dense forest stretching between the rift and Alden Shore. But only once we have acquired as many living mages as we can. As she began pacing back and forth, her movements were calculated, each step measured with the precision of a predator. Analyses and reports on how these beings can somehow detect and even see things from impossibly far distances. She explained, coming to a stop. We need to mitigate this advantage. The room listened intently as their Duchess closed her eyes and retreated back into her own mind. Several long minutes seemed to float by as they anxiously waited for her next instructions. And just when someone opened their mouth to ask if there was anything else she'd like done, Varasha's eyes suddenly shot open. Ankh, while we wait for these mages, go to every town and gather as many enchanters and artificers as you can and have them start weaving illusions and decoy enchantments. Barasha turned to one of her most trusted war mages, a pale-skinned and blonde-haired high elf man she had retained for centuries. Once the mages arrive, I need you to start teaching them Golmancy. Ancestry, the Duchess finally addressed the leader of her towery savages. I don't care what you do, but... Another hateful look spread across her face. Put a stop to these damned raids. As the days went by, Coleman meticulously refined Elijah's strategy and made operational changes that were a lot more palatable for an international force. Elijah's schemes often bordered on the brilliant, but said schemes required a firm hand to guide and temper them from their fringe or unhinged nature to functional and actionable. Elijah was wildly unpredictable, and he teetered on being sociopathic. Coleman often found himself in a curious position, both admiring and exhausted by Elijah's antics. It was no wonder he never progressed any further than his current position as simply a medic. Even though Elijah had the mind and skill sets to become a team leader himself, or even a Tier 1 operator, he was always constantly peered out of selection by cadre. While not quite a loose cannon, Elijah was still incredibly hard to control, especially when he thought he was right. His instincts were sharp, and he was deviously clever to the point where he was often 2 steps ahead of everyone else, but his whimsical nature was both a strength and a liability. At times, Elijah would suggest plans so outlandish and daring that they skirted the edges of recklessness. Yet, more often than not, they worked, often leaving Coleman in a state of reluctant awe. You deserve that fucking ferry, Coleman sighed exhaustedly as he walked towards a massive snaking river where Elijah had been supposedly last seen with a group of villagers doing laundry. The team had been saying the idiot had been chatting up one of the local girls for the past couple of days. Most of the villagers had already returned besides the 2 in question, and Coleman thought it'd be best he'd give his medic a stern talking to before he got any cute ideas. As he trudged down the rough and patchy dirt road, Coleman couldn't help but continue his grumbling. They're basically the same person. Just when I think I've got one under control, the other goes off rail. He finished, pinching the bridge of his nose. But if the idea of having to wrangle Elijah and his demented fairy was bad, a third wheel decided to enter the mix. The FNG, the fucking new guy, a term the ODA had settled on calling their newly minted engineer, Bennett, had been spending far too much time with Elijah. Not only was he adopting the medic's habits, but Bennett was also starting to pick up more unconventional and, practically speaking, insane tactical acumen. Letting out a heavy breath, Coleman started to near the river and noticed a singular basket full of rough linen sitting just to the side of the road. He was about to open his mouth and shout for his medic when a sudden movement caught his attention. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, stood up and crested over the riverbank with cheeks flushed a deep red. The woman cleared her throat and adjusted her knee-high dress while massaging her abdomen as if it were sore. But as Coleman processed the situation, he also saw Elijah's form popping up as the man hastily clamped his belt closed. Coleman's face became an unreadable mask as he stared deadpan at the 2, his eyes conveying both a lack of amusement and a lack of surprise. Are you fucking serious? He abruptly spoke up. The village girl let out a squeak in terror as she snapped around and stared at Coleman like a deer in the headlights. Upon realizing who it was, the villager's expression went from terror to deep embarrassment as she gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. After the brief moment of shock, she then averted her gaze, murmured an apology, and quickly trotted away through the underbrush towards the village. For the moment, Elijah remained frozen in place, but unlike the village girl, he held Coleman's gaze as they both became locked in an impromptu staring contest that neither seemed willing to lose. It was a battle of wills, an unspoken challenge between 2 soldiers who knew each other far too long and far too well. The tension was thick enough that one would have been able to cut it with a knife, and as the seconds ticked by, Elijah's eyes began to dart around, searching for any possible escape route. But sensing his subordinate's instinct to flee, Coleman's eyes narrowed as he spoke up with a monotone voice that carried an unmistakable edge of seriousness. I'll shoot you in the dick if you run. Elijah's eyes snapped back to Coleman, as he tried to discern whether to take that threat seriously or not. It was a ludicrous statement, yet coming from Coleman, there was a certain gravity to it. Elijah knew the man was capable of making good on his threats in the most unexpected ways. The standoff continued for a moment longer before Elijah let out a resigned sigh, conceding defeat as he raised his hand. Bro, chill. I'm, gathering intelligence and building rapport. He said, trying to use his silver tongue to get out of the shit he stepped into. Coleman's head flinched back, and his eyes fluttered for a moment as if he was assaulted with an impossibly heavy wave of mental damage in the form of stupidity. Rap rapport. He shouted back incredulously as he held his dead. Oh. Oh, you're building rapport. With a contemptuous laugh that echoed slightly through the grove, he gestured broadly around him as if presenting Elijah's absurd justification to an invisible audience. "Ahaha, how rude of me," he exclaimed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Then, pressing his fingertips to his chest as though pointing to himself, Coleman continued, his tone thick with mock apology. "I thought, you were fucking a local, I totally didn't realize you were building rapport." The word rapport was enunciated with a heavy dose of irony. Flopping his hand down to his side with a loud smack against his thigh, Coleman spoke a mock apology as he pouted his face. "I'm so sorry, Eli. How could I ever get those two mixed up?" The excuse was so absurd that even the birds seemed to pause in their singing. Elijah, for his part, managed to keep a straight face, though the corners of his mouth twitched as if fighting back a grin. "Hey man, look." He shrugged, keeping his tone convincingly unsure. "These guys get up to some crazy shit. If we want to probably engage in what I'd like to call village reorientation operations." Elijah was soon interrupted by a stick flying towards his face, which he managed to dodge barely. "Yo, chill. Shut the fuck up, you piece of shit." Coleman bellowed as picked up an even larger one and chucked it as his medic at full force. "You think you're gonna gaslight me? You think you're fucking smart?" This idiot had crossed a lot of lines, and Coleman had put up with a lot of Elijah's bullshit, but this was by far the stupidest thing he'd had the displeasure of dealing with, and his patience was worn thin. Fueled by righteous fury in the face of Elijah's antics, the team leader had escalated to hurling not just sticks and verbal barbs but also whatever he could lay his hands on in the environment. Elijah, for his part, danced around with a nimbleness that belied his usually laid-back demeanor, each dodge accompanied by a plea for reason. In an act of uncontrolled rage, Coleman grabbed a branch as thick as one's arm and jumped over the bushes to beat him with it. "What if you get her pregnant? What if Brass finds out? What if you get fucking space AIDS? Dude, relax. I used protection." Elijah called out from behind a large rock, attempting to bring some sense of rationality to the bizarre situation. This declaration brought Coleman to an abrupt halt as his expression morphed from one of fury into utter bafflement. "What?" Coleman exclaimed, the incredulity in his voice cutting through the tension. "What does that even mean?" Seizing the moment of pause, Elijah's head popped out from his makeshift cover. "You really think I'd come to a place with elves and catgirls without taking an industrial pack of condoms?" he quipped, his tone light but earnest. "Like, come on. Let's be real." The absurdity of the statement, combined with the sincerity with which Elijah delivered it, seemed to make Coleman feel like he was going to burst a blood vessel. However, his menace of a subordinate wasn't done there. Before Coleman could recover from the initial shock and gather his wits to launch another tirade, Elijah quickly shifted the conversation, hoping to distract his enraged team leader with potentially useful information. "Besides, I actually managed to get a tip on where some tax-collecting noble dickhead and his hoard of food is stashed," Elijah said, putting up his hands in surrender. "We can hit him and snatch it," he finished, backing up a little, hoping that would sate Coleman's anger. Coleman stood there, branch in hand, narrowing his eyes at his medic before tossing it to the ground and pointing at him. "This isn't over," he growled ominously before gesturing for Elijah to follow. This is madness." Count Harmswood, one of the very few human nobles of the Seraphic Empire, bellowed as his hand slammed into the table, sending scrolls flying onto the floor of his luxurious tent. "You'd be leaving me defenseless. I already have a manpower shortage, and now you'd deprive me of not just wyverns but all of my mana users." Standing across from him, seemingly unfazed and unbothered by the outburst, was Theraval, the Duchess's dark elf spymaster. Theraval remained stoic as Count Harmonswood's face turned a shade of deep red, the veins on his neck bulged with every word. As the tirade continued, spittle started to fly from the human's mouth, landing on the polished surface of the table and even on Theraval's dark cloak. Yet, the spymaster's demeanor did not change. There was no sign of disgust, no flinch, no reaction whatsoever. "Do you truly expect me to comply with such an insane request? You and that damned charlatan have both lost your minds." The Count sneered before spitting on the floor. "I cannot, and I shall not." Count Harmswood's rage seemed to swell within him, growing more intense with each passing moment. "I'll drag both you and that insufferable wench before the court of houses," he thundered, his voice echoing off the high walls of the chamber. You think you can force a noble of my standing to forfeit his property and forces unjustly? The court will see you stripped of your titles, your lands confiscated, and the Duchess fined. Perhaps you would even find yourself exiled, you insufferable cur. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the Count's threats and the tension of the confrontation. Yet, through it all, Tharival remained as impassive as ever, his expression never wavering from its cold neutrality. Once, the Count's rant had finally run its course, leaving him panting and glaring across the table. Do you truly intend not to comply with the Duchess's order? Tharival's voice was so calm and devoid of emotion that it seemed as if he was simply discussing the weather. No. The Count's response was a furious shout, his hand slamming down onto the table with such force that it splintered beneath them. I will not bend the knee to such outrageous demands. Unfazed by the outburst, Tharival's eyes scanned the room, looking at all the Count's personal guards in attendance. 2 mages and 6 mana-capable knights stood uncomfortably against the wall of the tent, just behind the Count. Is there nothing that will convince you otherwise? The dark elf asked, bringing his eyes back to the Count. Coin? Concessions? Favors? The Count's face twisted with hatred at the mere suggestion of compromise. I'd sooner turn my blade towards the Duchess herself than comply with anything that whore demands, he spat venomously, the words dripping with disdain and loathing. Tharival simply nodded as if the Count's refusal and insults were nothing more than he had expected. Very well, he said, his voice still calm and unbothered, before looking behind him to 2 of his own guards who accompanied him. These individuals wore unassuming attire, their features obscured behind black mosaic masks that shifted and morphed in subtle ways. Anyone looking at the masks would find their gaze unfocused, slipping across them as if they were merely part of the background. Beneath their dark cloaks was sleek armor made of a substance unfamiliar to the Count, a strange blend that was neither quite metal nor leather. Take the Count's head and slay any who resist, Tharival commanded his guards, and turned back to the Count. But before his eyes could leave the 2 shadow-like figures, their forms surged forward like a wisping darkness, their movements far too fast for any being's eye to comfortably track. Each unsheathed, jagged, wicked-looking blades, as long as one's forearms. There were subtle differences between each weapon, but they all had one thing in common. And that was the fact that they seemed to be forged from a strange blood-red metal that made people's blood run cold. The Count and his guards' eyes widened as they flinched back and grabbed at their weapons. However, before they could properly react, these ghosts were faster. Not a single sword left their sheath, and not a word was chanted before blood was drawn. As Harmswood opened his mouth to scream, a terrifying silence took hold instead. The world spun into a vortex of chaos, colors blurring and shapes warping as if reality itself was unraveling around him. Orders died on his lips, replaced by a mute plea for his men to save him. Then, he crashed to the ground, dizzy and disoriented. All sense of time and place dissolved, while his mind struggled to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before him. He was trapped in a maelstrom of motion where his guards, his paragons of strength, were being ruthlessly dismembered. The dark figures moved with a terrifying and unnatural speed. They were blurs of motion armed with those wicked, crimson-tinged blades felling seas and nights that were once symbols of power and protection as if they were pigs' lambs brought to feasts. Their armor offered no resistance as it was pierced effortlessly, and their cries were cut short, transforming into wet gurgles and sickening thuds as they collapsed. Blood splattered the interior of the tent, a gruesome crimson rain painting what had once been a place of noble authority into a scene of carnage. His loyal protectors, those who were supposed to be his shield, were now nothing but lifeless corpses strewn across the ground. Through his terror, the Count saw Tharival out of the corner of his eye. The dark elf stood unmoved, a cold spectator observing a symphony of violence orchestrated by his will. With one more attempted gasp, Harmswood's world plunged into darkness. With an air of nonchalant finality, Tharival strolled forward. He bent down, not a hint of bother on his face, and retrieved the severed head of Count Harmswood. The dark elf held the head aloft, examining it with a clinical detachment as if it were merely a curious specimen and not the remnants of a once powerful man. Hopefully, this will deter others from such foolishness, Tharival remarked with a chilling yet humored voice. I'm sure there will be a few more unwise enough to disobey our mistress, but let they and Count Harmswood serve as palpable enough deterrent to insubordination. The dark elf spun on his heel and strode confidently towards the tent flap while his masked guards moved like shadows in his wake. What had transpired was as swift as it was horrifying, from start to finish. The once opulent pavilion, a symbol of the Count's authority, had become a macabre slaughterhouse in mere seconds, and the air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood. Therival moved with the grace of a predator. He grasped a fistful of the Count's hair, casually swinging the severed head as he left the carnage behind. Stepping out of the tent, a scene of utter chaos greeted him. A cataclysmic roar had ripped through the air, an earth-shattering crash rattled the bones of every being within earshot. Tents flailed wildly, torn from their moorings, and scattered like scraps of paper by the force of the blast. Men were thrown off their feet, rolling across the dirt in a desperate bid for stable ground. And the source of such devastation was the immense silhouette of a black dragon. A very old and very powerful black dragon of monstrous proportions. Its landing had been a display of raw power, the earth itself sundered from its weight, cracking and buckling as the beast settled into place, and smoke curled from its nostril as its massive wings slowly unfurled. To Therival's left, a figure stood resolute against the swirling chaos. Clad in heavy plate armor, augmented by the bones and scales of vanquished wyverns. One of the Duchess's most powerful, and he was a testament to the mistress's influence and strength. The great warrior's hide cloak buffeted violently in the maelstrom, yet he remained steadfast, utterly unmoving. His massive sword was driven deep into the earth, his hands folded gently over the hilt, as he stared maliciously towards the soldiers and mages toppling head over heel. Striding past the warrior, Therival moved effortlessly underneath the dragon's colossal wingspan until reached the other side, where a panicked crowd was already gathering. He held up the Count's head for all to see and amplified his cold voice with magic, causing it to reverberate across the encampment. "Your treacherous lord is no more." Therival bellowed. He chose defiance. He chose death. And thus the fate of all who choose self-interest over the imperial war effort. The gathered soldiers gasped, their faces twisting into a mixture of shock, disbelief, and abject terror. This was a display of power unlike anything they had ever witnessed, the swift brutality, the utter disregard for a noble life, and now, the raw might embodied by the massive dragon that cast its imposing shadow over them all. A wave of shock and outrage swept throughout the Count's retinue. They stood frozen for moments, hands clenching around sheathed weapons, before the reality of the situation sunk in. Their lord was dead, his head held aloft like a grotesque trophy, a damned dark elf who stood before them. Yet, their fury was tempered by the sight of the colossal monstrosity looming above the foul man. Not even the stoic knight captain, his battle-scarred face creased in anguish, dared break the uneasy silence that had descended upon them. His eyes flicked between the severed head and what he considered the largest and oldest dragon he'd ever seen in his damnable life. It was bad enough one of the Duchess's heroes showed up, but with this monster here, all thoughts of vengeance were crushed beneath the weight of gaping maw staring at him. Therival lowered the head, allowing it swinging morbidly in his grip as he marched straight to the knight captain. Halting mere inches from the man, the dark elf looked down at him through his nose, despite the fact that he was a head shorter than the gruff knight. But how tall one was mattered very little at the current moment. For the poor captain fought to maintain any semblance of calm as his entire body trembled, not from mere cold, but from a primal, instinctual terror. "Gather your mana users. Assemble the wyverns, good captain." Therival commanded, his voice still magically amplified. "You will report to the Duchess in Aldenshire, and with haste. I trust," here Therival's gaze flicked meaningfully towards the dragon, "that you understand the urgency of this order?" His tone carried not a hint of a question, but the chilling finality of an ultimatum. The Duchess' word was now law, and the dragon was both enforcer and a grim reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Should the captain hesitate, should he choose to dally, the monstrous creature would likely make a far bloodier example than even the Count's brutal end. The knight captain could only bow his head and utter a hoarse, "Aye, my lord." Compliance, however grudging, was the only path to survival. Defiance meant not just death for himself, but the annihilation of his men. No amount of courage or pride could bridge the chasm of power that lay between them. An expression like a viper's grin spread across Therival's face. A macabre amusement flitted into his eyes as he raised Count Harmswood's head once more, slapping the lifeless cheek in a grotesque mockery of applause. "Very good," he declared, his amplified voice carrying an undercurrent of cruel delight. "You shall rest this day and prepare. But," his tone turned as sharp as a dagger, "do not keep us waiting. To delay the Duchess, well, that would be oh so very unwise." With a final flourish, Therival spun on his heel and marched away, but just before the dark elf disappeared below the hulking mass of the dragon, the knight captain attempted to rise to his feet. "Wait, my lord." the man stammered out as his hand reached out. However, the sudden movement had caught the dragon's attention. With a rumble that reverberated through the encampment, its massive head dipped low. Twin nostrils flared, expelling twin plumes of superheated plasma, as its eyes narrowed, burning with fury. The knight captain let out a yelp, a terrified sound he hadn't made since childhood. His body recoiled as if struck, and his legs had given way beneath him as he fell on his rear. Therival paused, turning back with feigned concern. His voice dripped with theatrical sympathy. "Oh dear, is there some problem, good captain?" He let the question hang in the air, before bursting into a peal of chilling laughter. With a dramatic gesture, he addressed the knight captain once more. "Well then, captain, go on. What is it that troubles you so?" There was an odd playfulness in the dark elf's tone that sent chills down every man in the count's army's spine. Panic surged through the knight captain. Caught between the titanic dragon and the mocking presence of the dark elf, fear threatened to swallow him whole. Each raspy breath seemed to drag against his throat, the superheated air of the dragon's breath filling his nostrils. It was an intoxicating mix of molten metal and sulfur, a scent that seemed to speak of fiery annihilation. He scrambled back even further as the dragon's head moved closer. Desperation lent his words a frenzied edge. What of the food stores, my lord? Are gathered supplies? And the men, the rest of the soldiers? Shall they march to Aldenshire with us, or remain? The words tumbled out, laced with the fear of asking the wrong question, of drawing further ire. Therival approached the man before halting a comfortable distance away. The knight captain flinched, averting his gaze from the dragon, and fixing it on the ground and started whispering prayers and reciting passages from the holy text of his god. Therival tilted his head, a curious, almost amused glint in his dark eyes. For a tense moment, he simply observed the knight captain, letting the silence stretch between them before heaving a heavy sigh. "Do you speak of the mundane?" His tone was flippant, laced with a hint of disdain. "Take them, leave them, it is of no concern to me," he answered, waving his hand dismissively. "Now that you have your answer, do not bother me with such trivial matters again. I have much more pressing concerns, and so little time." As Therival walked away, the knight captain scrambled to his feet. "Why, you heard him. Get your asses movin' less you want to be dragon feed," the man ordered with fear evident in his voice as the dark elf disappeared beneath the dragon. "And send word to the wyvern camps of our new orders." Silence reigned at the order as everyone stood stock still, but everyone was kicked into overdrive with one last snort from the monster. Soldiers, mages, and workers of every type scramble about with panicked efficiency. Carts were hastily loaded, men and women ran to and fro with bundles of supplies, and the injured were loaded onto wagons with utmost care. Within minutes, the once serene camp was transformed into a whirlwind of purposeful chaos. And as the madness unfolded, in a distant tree line, Coleman and his ODA team watched silently, peering through the optics of their weapons and purpose-built surveillance tools. "Fuck, is that our target's head?" Schwartz suddenly spoke up hushedly as he peered through the high-powered optic of his precision rifle. "I think that's his head." Coleman released an exasperated sigh as he watched with a camouflaged high-powered surveillance device as the strange dark-skinned man walked away with the noble's head in hand. Yep, that's his head," he nearly growled in annoyance. "Damn it. Wait, isn't this a good thing?" "We don't gotta kill him," Bennett piped up, a note of confusion in his voice. Elijah cut him off, the usual light-hearted tone gone from his voice. "No, dipshit, we wanted to bag him for questioning," he gestured at the chaotic camp with the barrel of his rifle, "and we can't question a corpse. All units, this is Baron Actual." Coleman quietly spoke into his headphones as he informed the litany of multinational special operations forces that were positioned or prowling around in preparation for the assault on this camp. "Change of plans, our target's Kia from internal fighting. Baron Actual, this is Warlock Actual. An Australian Special Air Services Regiment, SASR, team came over the net. That's a big fackin' cunt, mate. I'm not so sure about this one." No one could fault the assessment. That monstrosity of a dragon was well over 100 meters from snout to tail, and hefty enough to tank most of their firepower. "Baron Actual, copy that Warlock. Stand by, we're trying to figure something out. This is Bravo Actual. Yeah, I have agree with Warlock. This suddenly got a lot more dangerous. I don't think the operation's worth it with this thing hanging around. A new voice came over the net belonging to the Polish commandos, the Jednostka Wojskowa Komandoso, JWK, and gave his opinion on the matter. The chatter from other teams confirmed the general sentiment. They came in relatively light, hoping to do a lightning raid and bug out. Engaging this creature felt like a suicide mission. Sure, they could hit with every javelin or anti-tank weapon they had, but no one was convinced they'd be able to land a killing blow, and unless someone got lucky and domed the fucker. I can't believe we're blue-balled by a big fucking lizard. The Aussie's voice echoed throughout everyone's headphones. What do you think? Should we pull out? Coleman rubbed a weary hand across his eyes. The Aussie had put it crudely, but the sentiment was spot on. The mission was a bust. The tactical dilemma they faced had become far more complicated with the appearance of these newcomers and their dragon. Warlock, hold one. Coleman responded before leaning back against a fallen tree. A frustrated and heavy breath left the ODA team leader's mouth as he popped off his helmet, exposing his hair to the hot summer air. As he contemplated his opt-ins, while his hand rubbed across his admittedly greasy hair. It had been quite some time since he had a proper shower, and the dirt was starting to build up. As he thought of way to continue the mission, every scenario he spun out in his mind unraveled before it could take shape. Assault the camp now? With that dragon in the mix, it was madness. Their firepower was decent, but not against a beast of that size and unknown resilience. The thing would torch them before they knew what was going on. Sneak in, grab what intel they could? Nah, that was stupider than whatever some private fresh out of boot camp would think up. The goal was not to be decisively engaged. The Poles and Aussies had a point. Maybe the best course of action was to just to bugger off and keep an element here to observe and mark the location for when the ground pounders came in. But that almost felt like it was a waste. Here they had a prime opportunity to turn a village into a clandestine staging point, and letting go of that idea felt wrong. Just as another sigh left Coleman's mouth, an earth-shattering roar split the air. The team leader whipped his head up, expecting the worst-case scenario. The dragon had erupted into flurry of motion, as the whirlwind of claws, wings, and raw power took off, blowing debris across the camp and scattering tents like leaves in a storm. But it didn't attack. The gargantuan creature circled for a moment, leaving a sinister shadow against the clear blue sky, before banking and soaring eastwards. Coleman blinked, momentarily disoriented by the sudden shift in the situation. 100 thoughts raced through his head. Where was it going? It didn't notice us? Would it return? But within seconds, the beast had vanished into the distance. Then, a flicker of opportunity flashed across his eyes. This barren actual, let's wait a bit and see what happens, Coleman suggested with a predatory grin spreading across his face. Knight Captain Shaw barked orders at his men like a rabid dog. His voice was hoarse and edged with panic as exhaustion gnawed at his already frayed mind. His body became heavy, and his thoughts became a haze of fatigue, but he continued to push his men and himself relentlessly throughout the night. Pick up the damned pace, he roared, his spittle flying. I'll flog any ye fucks that think to dally. That foul dark elf had said they'd have an entire day to rest, but Shaw wasn't going to trust the word of some knife-eared prick that gobbled down a bigwig noble's dick as far as he could, the devious bastard. However, his men were weary and weren't keen on complying. Shaw could understand the sentiment, but they didn't know what he knew. They haven't experienced the backstabbing nature and the insidious doublespeak that came with upper society. He had to make them comply through any means necessary, even if it meant taking a head or two. Shaw's eyes darted nervously between the men scurrying around and the eastern night sky, searching for any sign of that damned dragon. The sudden appearance and subsequent disappearance had left him unnerved. Usually, something that big and that old was accompanied by entire cities being put to the torch just to make a point, and the fact that Shaw's lord was executed and labeled as a traitor didn't bode well. The feathered bitch wasn't fucking around, and she was out for blood. But Captain Shaw, the dark elf, said we had an entire day to rest, a young, newly anointed knight ventured. His voice was barely above a whisper, heavy with the unspoken fear they all felt. Are ye an imbecile, lad? Shaw snapped, grabbing the man by the collar of his shirt and yanking him closer. Do ye trust a snake with your neck? He jabbed a calloused finger at the knight's chest, spraying him with spittle. That dark-skinned bastard will sell us out the moment it suits him. We march now, or that piece of shite will label us as traitors as well and have that damned monster breathing fire upon us before dawn. Shaw released the young knight with a final shove, sending him stumbling backward. Paranoia flickered in the knight captain's eyes as his hand twitched toward the hilt of his sword, itching for the comfort of solid steel in a world gone mad. Every rustle of leaves, every distant animal cry, sent shivers down his spine, and his gaze darted back to the horizon with a desperate intensity. "Move," he bellowed, his voice cracking with strain. "We cannot afford to linger here another moment. Get those wagons loaded and those supplies packed. We must be gone before dawn breaks." The men and women of the camp scrambled to obey, and as Shaw watched them, his jaw set, his body thrumming with restless energy. This was no longer simply a means to collect tribute and supply the war effort, it was a desperate flight for survival. He cast a glance over his shoulder, half expecting that dark elf and his shadows to be watching them with their dark eyes gleaming with cold amusement. To Shaw's relief, the bastard and his minions were nowhere to be seen. But after seeing just how long it was taking for their departure to take shape, an uneasy feeling formed in the pit of his stomach. Wagons were being overloaded with barrels of grain, crates of hardy fruits and vegetables, and cages of squawking chickens. Larger, bulkier beasts like the lean, razor-fanged wargs used as war mounts were being prepped by riders, and the plump, docile, shaggy-horned beasts that were bred for burden were not even ready. The first light of the morning was coming soon, and they were nowhere near ready for departure. By the Emperor's balls. Shaw swore under his breath. At this rate, they'd be lucky to move more than a kilometer before the afternoon. Fury surged through him like a wildfire. This was no army, no fighting unit, it was a disorganized mob. With a snarl, he stomped towards a group of soldiers struggling to hoist a massive crate of chickens, clucking away, onto the back of a groaning wagon. "Leave it!" The knight captain barked, his voice a whip-crack across the hushed camp. "Leave all of it. Gods damn it all." The soldiers stopped, their eyes wide with shock. "Be but captain," one stammered, "the count." "The count's dead, you fool!" Shaw roared, kicking the crate. It slid with a thud, spilling its precious contents across the dirt. "We're leaving this wrong shit behind if we want to see another sunrise." And just as those words left the good knight captain's mouth, dawn's first rays painted the eastern horizon, causing his face to fall. They were nowhere near ready. Yet, even as panic began to gnaw at him, a screeching cry pierced the air as a chorus of shrieks echoed from the skies. Shaw spun around, his heart pounding in horror, thinking it was a dragon, but instead, a flock of wyverns graced his vision. Dozens upon dozens of the smaller dragon-like beings soared across the skies, their leathery wings blotting out the rising sun. It was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It was a reminder of the monstrous power the Count held as a breeder. A surge of relief crashed over Shaw. The messages had reached Count's wyvernic nesting grounds, and the message he'd sent just after that damned dark elf played his bloody theatrical games made it. One wyvern and its rider and a woman donning a dark gambeson reinforced by chain mail assessed the situation below before descending for a landing. Finally, he breathed, a flicker of hope rekindling in his chest as he walked towards the woman and saw she had steel hair with the weathered face of a seasoned rider. Grabbing her blade staff, the woman dismounted and casted a quick protection spell as her wyvern snarled and snapped at a few workers who had gotten too close. "Captain Shaw, I take it," she said warily, peering around the camp to spot any sign of deception. "I'm Commander Ira, of the Barbed Talon. We received the Lord Harmswood's message. What in all the abyss is going on?" Shaw swallowed, trying to keep the desperation from seeping into his tone. "A change of plans, Commander. The Duchess," he lowered his voice, "has decided to consolidate our Lord's forces." Ira frowned, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the camp before pulling off her riding cap, exposing her pointed ears, and eyed Shaw in disbelief. "And our Lord agreed to this?" She replied incredulously, her hand tightening around her staff. Shaw hesitated, 1,000 half-truths and evasions flashing through his mind. The reality they just experienced was so convoluted, so insane, that it would likely sound like the ramblings of a lunatic. Yet, lying to one like Commander Ira's gaze, with an entire wing of wyverns, seemed an even worse idea than telling the truth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "No, Commander," he admitted, his voice surprisingly steady. "The Count is dead. Executed. By the Duchess' hand." "Executed? Over what?" Ira recoiled in surprise as the grip on her blade staff loosened ever so slightly. "Treason," Shaw said, the word heavy on his tongue. "That dark elf, Theraval, accused Lord Harmswood of defiance in the Duchess and took his head. A storm brewed in Alira's silver eyes as her expression darkened. Her wyvern, sensing the shift in her mood, let out a low, menacing growl, its eyes flickering with a fire mirroring its rider's anger. The air around them seemed to chill, and the morning's light did little to dispel the growing tension. "Treason," she echoed, her voice sharp as the blade of her staff. "And you let this happen? You didn't think to stop them?" Shaw flinched under her gaze, the weight of his decisions, and their consequences, bearing down on him. "We couldn't," he protested, his voice strained. "They had a dragon. An elder, or perhaps even an ancient one. It was unlike anything I ever did see. We wouldn't even been able to make the monster sneeze, let alone stop him." The fire in Ira's wyvern's mouth started to billow with a raise of her hand as her frustration reached a boiling point. "So, you chose to let the murderer of our lord walk away unscathed and seize his wyverns under false pretenses." Her tone was icy, and each word stabbed at the knight captain like a dagger. As the wyvern crept closer with its jaw parting slightly letting Shaw see the vortex of flame building within its maw, the knight captain backed away with fear in his eyes. What could I have done against such a monster?" he pleaded with a voice cracking with strain. "Even with your entire wing, we all would have been done in. We gon' do nothing but annoy it." Ira sneered dismissively, flicking her hand in a quick gesture that caused her wyvern to calm down. "Bah," she exclaimed in frustration. She hated it, but she knew this coward had a point. Fighting even a senior dragon, let alone a young, teenage dragon, would have been suicide for this lot. With the wyvern glaring menacingly at the knight captain, Ira's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the ragtag group of soldiers and mages. Her mind started to race through scenarios, each one ending in disaster if they were to face such a beast head-on. "Feel grateful that I show you mercy, plebeian," she finally said, her voice laced with disdain before turning around and rubbing the snout of her wyvern. "It's okay, precious. I'll feed you something more delicious than a dickless coward," Ira cooed and soothed her bestial companion and scratched under its chin. "I don't even know what Count Harmswood was thinking when giving a lowly knave like him hereditary peerage." The knight captain gritted his teeth at the insult as Ira let out a derisive sigh. Without another word, the wing commander turned and mounted her wyvern before looking down at her so-called counterpart with a contemptuous look in her eyes. Shaw, despite his anger and frustration, couldn't meet her gaze, feeling the sting of her shaming. With a harumph that echoed throughout camp, Ira squeezed her thighs against the wyvern's flanks. The language of pressure was all the creature needed, recognizing its rider's keen desire to take flight. In response, the beast's mighty wings beat the air, and a whirlwind of power kicked up dust and debris. The force of the takeoff was a visceral thrill, propelling Ira and her mount skyward, leaving awestruck faces below. As they ascended, the wyvern flock fell into formation behind their leader, forming a disciplined wedge, cleaving through the air. They flew eastward, bound for Aldenshire, the rising sun painting long shadows across the land. Looking around him, the knight captain wore an expression that told of humiliation. The man clenched his fist as his eyes darted across each face, accusing them of also mocking him before violently swinging his arm to the side and barking orders. "What the hell are ye all looking at? Get back to work." In his anger, the knight captain's hand went to his sword. "We're leaving in an hour." With a final bellow, Shaw stormed back towards his tent, obscenities trailing behind him. His men, startled into action, scurried about, the camp abuzz with renewed purpose. Meanwhile, still hidden in the foliage with their eyes trained on the chaotic scene, Coleman and his ODA team exchanged glances. "That's a lot of lizards," Bennett whispered with awe evident in his voice. "Yah," Lister drawled, all headed east, following that big-ass bitch. Coleman's brows furrowed, a contemplative hum escaping his lips. "I think this camp is getting ready to move too." "Whatcha think they're running from?" Bennett asked, turning to Coleman and lifting his eyebrow. "Us?" Offering a simple shrug in reply, Coleman pressed his face back into his specialized surveillance equipment. "Who knows? Maybe they got spooked by the Rangers when they raided." He paused, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Regardless, we're gonna be hitting this place once they piss off." Elijah watched the retreating wyverns, his gaze focused on the lead rider. "That shiny one riding on the flyer, she's a problem," he muttered, his voice laced with a hint of menace. "Got the feel of someone actually competent." Coleman nodded slowly, his own gaze fixed on the departing figures. "This the main reason why I want to wait till they're long gone. They're already unloading livestock and what I think is vegetables." He looked over to Elijah as he spoke. We can slip in, grab what we need, and bug out before anyone knows we're there. I'd still like to snatch one of them up, Elijah replied, rubbing the back of his neck and wearing a complicated expression. There's a mass exodus heading east, and any information we can get our hands on would be worth its weight in gold. He finished before ripping a piece of jerky in half and sharing it with his patron, who was happily munching away on his shoulder. A deep breath of air left Coleman's mouth as he sat back and thought for a moment. I don't know. There's a lot of the bastards in there. His gaze turned to Quan, the team sergeant, in the hopes that he might have some kind of tactical insight. Any ideas? Folding his arms and looking up at the sky, Quan let out a contemplative groan and crossed his arms. Well, I have a few ideas. He drawled. Why don't we turn this into a three-pronged attack? We've got those poles further up the road to the east. Quan's head gestured towards one of two dirt roads leading into the place, and the Aussies are somewhat near us, right? We could coordinate an ambush, Quan continued. The poles brought heavier gear with them and could cause some serious ruckus in the middle of that convoy. He said, standing up and grabbing a stick. Quan then started drawing a line in the dirt to represent the convey and then drew an arrow interdiction its midsection. They can get good and riled up, draw the majority attention away from us while we and the Aussies hit the rear, nabbing anything and anyone worth taking. Coleman stroked his chin thoughtfully. The commandos would buy us time, and if we just focus on just snatching shit, the rest of the convoy wouldn't even realize the tail was getting schwacked. He added, nodding thoughtfully. I like it. Yeah, not bad, Elijah joined in with a wolfish grin. It's the kind of chaos that just feels right, you know? Didn't we bring mortars? We could just start dropping shit on them while the poles rough them up. Bennett chimed in. A thought hum left Coleman's voice as he wore a face that said he was deliberating on parting with something precious. Yeah, however. He started with a cautious note in his voice, we don't exactly have that many rounds, so we should only use them for a special occasion. Elijah cocked his head, munching on his bit of jerky. Sure, but isn't this pretty much a special occasion? If we're gonna use this is the scenario for it. Quan nodded in agreement. The two goons got a point. Dropping a few surprises in the middle of their convoy while the poles stir up trouble would pretty much ensure our success. He added while kicking his makeshift battle plan to break it up. It's apparent they don't know how to deal with indirect fire yet, so we should take advantage of it while we can. Coleman sighed dreadfully as he hung his head and capitulated to his men. The idea of raining a bit of death and destruction definitely held an undeniable appeal, especially with the fact that it would significantly reduce the chance of casualties. He needed to stop being a miser and use what they had to its fullest extent. All right, we'll use the mortars, he declared, standing up. We'll zero for a pre-designated spot where the commandos will engage them, drop a shitload of mortars, and scare the hell out of them. However, the team leader murmured as he still felt like there were some glaring flaws in the plan. These shitheads still use magic to augment their physical abilities, so it's still gonna get dicey. Any idea on how to subdue one of them? Coleman asked, looking around. The team fell into a heavy silence, with each member becoming lost in their own thoughts. They had always engaged the enemy from a distance or at least had enough space between them to riddle each prospective warrior with bullets. The question of subduing someone, especially those using magic to enhance themselves, seemed incredibly unwise. Everyone exchanged uncertain looks and collectively shrugged as they acknowledged their lack of a solid plan for non-lethal engagement. A heavy silence descended upon the team as everyone looked at each other with eyes the kind laden with uncertainty. They'd always fought these magic users with the buffer of distance. But close up? That was another question they weren't too keen on finding out. Ever the one to think outside the box, Elijah hummed in interest. Hey, Yana, he called out, tapping the bag of beef jerky that had her little legs sticking out of it. Do you have any way to drop some dude without, turning them into crispy a critter? He asked as her legs kicked angrily at the sudden smack. Suddenly, her legs sunk into the bag and her toony head popped out, narrowing her eyes at her insufferable human. Ha! An irritated and confused look clouded the little fairy's face, clearly taken aback by the question. Why would I do something so nonsensical and stupid as that? She retorted, her tone dripping with disdain. And why are you so insolent all of the time? Unfazed by Yana's outburst, Elijah met her annoyed gaze with a mischievous and calculating look that flashed across his face for a moment. "Oh, if you can't do it, then don't worry about it," he said, his voice dripping with a challenge that insinuated the task was out of her capabilities. He continued, adding fuel to the fire, "If it's beyond your means, then don't worry about it. We'll figure something out." Yana stared at him blankly for a few moments. She couldn't believe the words that left her apostle's mouth. Wand was clearly unable to process what was just said. The very implication that something might be beyond her capabilities was not just an affront to her pride, but an insult that couldn't be left unanswered. Then, suddenly, her hair billowed like a raging flame, a physical manifestation of her indignation. Her reaction was instantaneous and intense. In a blur of motion that caught everyone off guard, she zipped out of the bag of jerky and grabbed a fist full of Elijah's long hair, yanking on it as she brought her face close to his, her eyes ablaze with a fiery fury. "What do you mean by can't and beyond my means? I am a goddess," she yelled, her voice a mix of anger and wounded pride. "You insolent little man. You idiot. You dummy." Elijah couldn't help but wince at the deceptively powerful tug. His tactic of provoking Yana into action had worked a little too well. "Ow, ow, ow. Yana, chill," he yelped as she pulled harder, growling at him. "I'm sorry. Relax. I believe you're capable of anything." "Humph." Yana harumphed as she released her human. "Well, of course I am," she huffed, crossing her arms and spinning around in annoyance. "The mere fact you questioned my ability is not only unacceptable, but rude. Rude, 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 rude." As everyone stared at the two as if they lost their minds, Elijah rubbed his head where Yana had yanked his hair, wincing slightly from the unexpected fierceness of her grip. "God damn," he muttered under his breath, but a grin still formed on his face. She had taken the bait, but now he had to see if he could reel her in. Looking up at the tiny goddess, who was now floating with an air of indignation, Elijah decided to shift gears and aim to appease her wounded pride. "Well, I just never seen you in action, you know? Maybe you could give your favorite human a demonstration of how magnificent you can be?" His tone was a mix of genuine curiosity and a dash of flattery, hoping to smooth over the ruffled feathers. "Maybe stretch your arms out and test the new strength you've been gaining?" Still hovering with her arms crossed, Yana paused at the request. Her anger momentarily gave way to intrigue. The idea of showcasing her abilities, particularly after having them doubted, was an appealing opportunity to reassert her divine prowess, especially since she had taken a small slice of power from the few souls she had helped pass. Her expression softened slightly, and the flames in her hair dimmed as she considered Elijah's proposal. "A demonstration, you say?" Yana mused, her voice losing some of its earlier sharpness. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to remind you mortals of the extent of my power." Elijah gave a cheeky grin to the rest of his team, who just stared at him as if he were a madman. "We just need you to make the person I point out squeal in pain while we tie him up." If there was a word to describe Shaw, it was anxious. Even since he was a lad, he'd been plagued by a paranoia that bordered on illness. He saw shadows where others saw light and whispers where others heard silence. This constant state of vigilance made him a difficult man to know and an even harder man to befriend. His mind was always racing, always strategizing, always expecting the worst. It was both his curse and his salvation. Shaw's upbringing did little to quell these instincts. Born into bondage, he learned early on that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every friendly gesture was scrutinized, every helping hand inspected for hidden daggers. While isolated, this mindset honed his instincts to a razor's edge and imbued him with a rare resilience among his peers. Even now, he could feel the whispers and jeering of his men. Even though every face was engrossed in their work to get this convoy moving, Shaw could see the mocking gazes. However, whenever he focused in on an individual, they'd always pretend they'd done nothing but work. "Liar!" Shaw barked at one young knight who had walked past him with the reins of a war horse in one hand and those of a warg in another. "Ye think me a fool not to see your mutterings? Ye mock me just like that wyvern whore," he nearly screeched, approaching the young man with an aggressive and accusing finger pointed. The young knight flinched away violently from the sudden verbal attack as spittle flew in his face. The horse, startled by the sudden commotion, neighed and dangerously spun around, its hooves threatening to kick. In a frantic effort to get the beast under control, the young knight scrambled, trying to calm the agitated animal while also defending himself against the barrage of accusations. "I didn't say a word, Captain," he protested with a voice laced with panic. I'm just fetching the mount like I was told. Complete confusion clouded the young knight's face as he looked around, trying to gauge if others had witnessed the outburst and could offer some explanation for Shaw's sudden fury. But there was no solace to be found in the faces of his comrades. The men and women of Shaw's command were well accustomed to his paranoia and accusations. They had learned to keep their heads down and continue their work, even when the knight captain laid into them. A lesson this poor soul had yet to learn. The incident with the young knight was a spark in a tinderbox. Shaw's anxieties, fueled by the humiliating encounter with Ira and the lingering sting of failure, now burned out of control. Every shadow seemed to contain a conspiracy, every glance held hidden contempt. His frantic walk towards Lord Harmswood's tent was marked by further incidents. Warriors, mages, and laborers alike scattered before him, startled by the wild look in his eyes and the incoherent accusations he flung about frivolously. Lost in a mental storm, Shaw was oblivious to the fact he was delaying the departure of the convoy with each one of his episodes, and he couldn't help but curse the incompetence Harmswood stuck him with. With the Count now on his mind, the knight captain couldn't help but tighten his grip in frustration. Harmswood was the one who had elevated him to a position of power. The Count had given him a chance when others had scorned his low birth as a son of a slave. He owed the nobleman everything. But in Shaw's twisted perception, Harmswood was not a savior but an architect of his misfortune. Harmswood! The knight captain snarled, his gaze darting around the tent as if seeking out hidden enemies. Ye deserved everything ye got. Ye knew about those monsters, and ye sent me to my death. He continued to have an internal meltdown as he came to a stop in front of the Count's personal tent. She knew. Shaw muttered, his voice a strangled whisper. She knew this would happen, she knew they'd be there, that damned beast. That damned whore probably lead them here. Shaw clenched his jaw tightly as he started pacing back and forth in front of the Count's tent. That BACKSTABBR knew it from the beginning and took advantage of the fact I have nothing but these pathetic and incompetent lemmings. His hand clenched into a fist, fingernails biting into his thumb so hard that blood started to flow. Hyperventilating, Shaw's vision fixated on the flaps of the tent. He knew all manners of luxurious treasures he couldn't even fathom were behind those two simple pieces of cloth. All the decadent joys he was denied access to just because of his low birth. The knight captain stepped forward and reached out to push them apart. All he had to do was step inside and take what was rightfully his, but a voice called out before his hand could reach the entrance. "Am my lord?" Shaw snapped around, and half drew his sword, ready to strike down anyone foolish enough to sneak up on him. However, his hand stayed as his eyes settled on a terrified, portly woman who seemed to be cowering, hoping that her head would remain attached to her shoulders. I apologize, my lord. The convoy is all ready to depart." She stuttered, flinching back and looking back at the knight standing a ways away for help. But instead of rushing to her aid, the men simply motioned encouragingly for her to continue. They said we're. "Be silent, woman!" Shaw shouted, causing the woman to recoil as if struck. Her eyes widened in terror, and for a long moment, Shaw simply glared at her before turning his furious gaze toward the knight standing in the distance. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the muted sounds of the camp preparing for departure. Sheathing his sword with an angry clang, the knight captain let out a frustrated breath. "Pathetic whelps. He spat with a voice full of venom, too afraid to fight their own battles, and they call me a coward." He then turned his back on the woman, dismissing her as a mere annoyance. "Tell them to start, I have my own tasks." He barked before pausing at the entrance to the tent. "I'll catch up with the rear if they've managed to put some distance between themselves and me," he said with a parting sneer, just before he swept into Harmswood's tent. Once inside the luxurious space, Shaw's gaze took in a hellish scene. He had expected pure savagery with blood and gore all over the place, but he had to admit what he found scared him more. Everything was as pristine and perfect as when he was last in here, except for the headless corpse of the Count sitting at his magnificent desk along with his dismembered bodyguards behind him. Whoever that damned dark elf had brought to attack the Count didn't even give them time to blink and cut them down with such clinical precision as speed. Shaw considered they didn't even fully realize they were being attacked. The interior of Lord Harmswood's tent was an assault on the senses. Accustomed to the austerity of campaign life, even Shaw found the lavishness bordering on obscene. Rich tapestries hung on the walls, depicting scenes of mythical hunts and fantastical beasts. A bed of cushions and exotic furs was piled in the center on top of plush carpets that would likely fetch a small fortune in any kingdom. A gilded brazier burned with sweet-smelling incense, masking the lingering scent of blood left by the recent attack. But the centerpiece of this excessive display was Harmswood's desk. A monstrous thing crafted from dark ebony and inlaid with intricate silver designs, it was there that the Count conducted his affairs. And it was there he met his end. A labored breath left the knight captain's mouth as he meandered over to the pile of cushions and furs that he realized the Count used as a bed and flopped lazily on it. The plush softness swallowed Shaw whole, a stark contrast to the straw-filled pallets and worn linens that were his usual sleeping accommodations. He closed his eyes, letting out another sigh that sounded content. His troubles seemed to recede in this decadent haven for just a moment. How long? He mused aloud, his voice barely a whisper. How long had he endured the gnawing hunger, the harsh elements, the constant sting of disrespect? How long had his toil, sweat, and blood lined Harmswood's coffers and fueled the Count's ambitions? The answers were a leaden weight upon his soul. For over a decade, possibly multiple decades, he had been nothing but a tool, a beast of burden for a man consumed by greed and indifferent to the plight of anyone but his coffers. He had endured it all with stoic obedience, believing that loyalty and hard work would be their own reward. But now, lying in a headless Count's bed, surrounded by stolen riches, Shaw's perspective was shifting. A lifetime of servitude felt like a cruel joke, a mockery of the dreams he'd once held as a boy. The dreams of honor, of a life worth living, dreams Harmswood and his kind carelessly trampled underfoot. The warmth of the furs seeped into Shaw's weary bones, a delicious lethargy settling over him. As he sank deeper into the cushions, he closed his eyes and made a silent vow. Never again would he sweat and strain for another silver-spooned fop. He had played the loyal dog for long enough, and his reward was always blood and nightmares. But now he had a dead man's riches. Now he was done with servitude. He would complete this one final task, this errand for the Duchess, and then he would disappear. Vanish into the anonymity of the wider world and start anew. His thoughts turned to the multitude of possibilities. Perhaps he could turn his hand to banditry. With his experience and a few like-minded men, he could strike at supply caravans, prey on those very merchants and nobles who had grown fat on the labor of the common folk. A dark smile played on his lips. There was a certain poetic justice to the idea. Or maybe, with the gold he was about to liberate, he could assemble a mercenary company. He knew war, and there was always war to be fought somewhere for the right price. He was never one for righteousness or justice. He was more of a convenience and practicality kind of man, and with enough coin, he might even earn a reputation and perhaps become someone to be reckoned with. He glanced around the tent, spotting goblets and locked cabinets. There was more to be had here, a fortune that could well and truly set him on his path. But first, he'd like to take a quick rest. Just 5 minutes of blissful oblivion before he tackled the practical matters of his escape. With a sigh that was half exhaustion and half contentment, Shaw closed his eyes. His chaotic mind began to drift, and the cares of the day seemed to dissolve in the soft warmth. However, sleep came for Shaw like a thief in the night. The soft embrace of the furs had been a trap. He had meant only to rest his eyes for a mere moment and gather his thoughts, but instead, he was plunged into a deep, dreamless slumber. Shaw threw himself forward as he woke up with a start. He found himself disoriented as he peered around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, and flailed forward as if the plush piles of fur stung. How long had he slept? Had the camp already left? Panic flared within the knight captain as he rose to his feet. Curse it all! A scream left the man's mouth as he burst from the tent like a bat out of hell. With a thumping heart, Shaw's head snapped from side to side, scanning the scene before him. And what he saw made his blood run cold. The encampment was gone. The tents, the wagons, the milling soldiers and servants, all vanished. Only the churned-up earth and trampled grass remained as evidence of the recent whirlwind of activity. A wave of despair threatened to overwhelm Shaw. Had he slept for half an hour? An hour? Half a day? How could he have been so foolish, so carelessly indulgent? For a moment, he stood rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of paranoid thoughts and fear, until a somewhat familiar voice spoke up. Captain? The voice cut through Shaw's despair like a knife. He whirled around, his hand going instinctively to the empty space where his sword should have been. For a heart-stopping moment, he feared it was some ambush, some cruel trick of fate. But when his eyes focused, he saw the young knight, the one he'd berated so harshly earlier. The lad sat nervously atop a warwurg. The creature was a strange blend of a wolf with a hyena-like head. Easily reaching the size of a beast of a horse, it wore a muscular build, and its fur was a mottled gray and brown while its long, thick tail trailed behind it, occasionally smacking the ground with a powerful swat. Despite its fearsome appearance, the young knight seemed to handle the creature with ease. He sat confidently in the saddle, his hand rubbing the side of the warg's thick neck. The beast itself seemed more curious than anything else, its gaze fixed on Shaw with an intelligent glint in its red eyes. Most importantly, the reins to another warg were nestled within the lad's other hand. Taking a cautious step forward, the young man extended his free hand, the reins of the spare warg dangling harmlessly. Sir. He started, his voice strained with trepidation. The lieutenant thought you might need a steed. He swallowed hard, and, well, the camp had traveled quite a ways by now. His words seemed to hang awkwardly in the air. Shaw glowered at him, his gaze shifting to the monstrosity at his side, then back again. The young knight braced himself instinctively, expecting another outburst. However, Shaw remained silent, albeit for an uncomfortably long moment. The air filled with the unspoken tension of their last encounter as the knight captain glared at the young man. Inside, Shaw was warring with himself. What's your name, boy? He spoke with a less accusatory and more resigned tone as he approached and took the reins of the free warg. The young knight blinked, startled out of his fearful hunch. While still gruff, Shaw's change in demeanor caught him off guard. He'd half expected another paranoid tirade accusing him of insubordination or mockery. Instead, he was being addressed, if not with respect, at least with something resembling acknowledgement. Hugh, sir. He straightened slightly in the saddle, his voice gaining a touch more confidence. Hugh of Arling. Shaw grunted, a hint of a skeptical smile playing about his lips. Of Arling, eh? Sounds fancy. He paused as if considering something, then nodded. Well, Hugh of Arling, you've done right by me. But you're still a bushy-eyed and insufferable shit. Hugh's eye twitched at the insult. He opened his mouth to protest, to ask for some justification behind such a harsh label, but a wiser instinct held his tongue. Arguing with the knight captain, while slightly less volatile at the moment, was a surefire way to end up back on the receiving end of his temper. Before Hugh could respond, Shaw had turned his attention back to the warg beside him. He ran a hand over its coarse fur, studying the creature with a critical eye. Never liked these damned beasts, he muttered, his frown deepening. Sooner to bite your head off than carry you reliably. With a sigh, Shaw moved around his mount and saw 2 saddlebags and a visibly empty wooden-framed burlap sack attached snugly to the creature's rear. A flash of realization crossed Shaw's face as a cunning glint entered his eyes. Stay here, boy, the knight captain barked as newfound energy filled his voice. Keep the warg steady. Before Hugh could fully process the order, Shaw was already darting back into the tent with the empty saddlebags and framed burlap sack in hand. Hugh stared, open-mouthed, as a cacophony of sounds erupted from within. Items clattered against the ground, muffled curses echoed out, and a bout of manic laughter sent shivers down Hugh's spine. For his life, Hugh couldn't understand what the captain was doing in the name of all that was holy. This was the Count's tent, was he doing what he thought he was doing? Questions swirled in Hugh's mind, and his worry grew with each passing moment. If he was, then if Wyvern Commander Ira ever found out. Gods, he would be complicit just for standing here, and there would be no saving them from a fiery end if they weren't fed outright to that beast. Minutes stretched into eternity. Hugh shifted nervously in his saddle. The warg beneath him whined, sensing his anxiety, and the young knight ran a soothing hand over its coarse fur, trying to calm both the beast and himself. Just when his nerves were about to fray completely, Shaw burst forth from the tent, his arms laden with the saddlebags and the burlap sack, now bulging at the seams with a mysterious load. A manic smile crossed the knight captain's face. Hugh! Shaw shouted, his voice hoarse with excitement. Help me remount this, will you? We need to make haste. Completely bewildered, Hugh couldn't help but blink. Sir, I don't understand, what? He stammered. No time for questions, boy. Shaw snapped, his impatience clear. He shoved the saddlebags into Hugh's hands. Just do as you're told. Hugh held his tongue, swallowing back the torrent of questions swirling in his mind. The captain's erratic behavior, the manic glint in his eyes, there was no point in arguing. All he could do was follow orders, hold his tongue and hope word doesn't make it to Commander Ira. It didn't take long for the two to secure the saddlebags, make their out of the camp. Their beasts snorted and dug their claws into the ground, tearing down the eastern road at a breakneck pace. Each jarring step causes metallic clinks to echo through the air and shimmers of light to leak out of the bulging bags. Riding close behind the captain, Hugh caught a glimpse of the source, golden goblets and other wares spilling out from a tear, their brilliance amplified by a faint, otherworldly glow. There was no mistaking it, Shaw had robbed the long-expired Count's tent, an act of greed and treason that could bring the wrath of the realm down upon them. Especially when he saw the bulging framed burlap sack secured just behind Shaw. It shifted precariously, threatening to spill its contents at any moment. Within its depths, something protruded, a dark, ovoid shape, smooth and almost obsidian in its blackness. Hugh squinted, hoping and praying to every god in every pantheon that it was not what he thought it was, or else Ira would forsake the Empire to hunt them down. The two rode hard as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. The warg's powerful strides ate up the miles until they soon saw the faint outlines of carriages, horses, and other war beasts, and relief washed over Shaw like a cool balm. "Hail!" Shaw boomed, raising an arm in greeting as two grizzled riders approached from the rear of the convoy. Mounted on war horses, they cut a less terrifying figure than his warg, but their armor gleamed with hard-won practicality. The guard stiffened upon seeing him, eyes widening in surprise. "Captain Shaw," one of them exclaimed. "We thought you'd be at the head of the caravan." A mask of nonchalance settled over Shaw's features. "I was delayed," he replied in a casual voice. "But all's well now." "Well, sir, it's good to see you," the other guard started, but Shaw cut him off with a raised hand. "And while ye lot left me," he growled scornfully before gesturing towards Hugh. Hugh of Arling showed spirit and loyalty by remaining with a spare mount. Shaw begrudgingly spoke approval of the young man. His men remained silent and cringed under their knight captain's glare. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Shaw threw himself off his mount and moved to unbuckle the luggage to the rear of his work. "Now," he said, lifting up the framed sack gently and bringing it to the rearmost carriage, "what's the news? Any trouble on the road?" Shaw carefully nestled the burlap sack between furs, extra weapons, and what appeared to be the cart driver's meager personal effects. There, hidden amongst the mundane, its sinister contents would hopefully remain undiscovered. Satisfied that his most dangerous cargo was secured, he returned to his warg, where the saddlebags bulged with their promise of stolen riches. "A few highwaymen were foolish enough to think us a merchant caravan, Captain," one of the guards answered, his voice weary. "There were a few small bands of highwaymen, nothing the vanguard couldn't handle. Too bold for their own good." "Morale?" Shaw pressed. This was the key, the weakness he could exploit. "The lesser mages are spent," the other guard replied. "The lack of sleep is starting to get to people. And with the fate of the Count..." He trailed off, his face clouding over with uncertainty. Shaw nodded. The Count's death had undoubtedly shaken them. Loyalty was a fickle thing and only reliable when reinforced by wealth and authority. Both were now in question. Provide them with extra rations and wine. Just as he ordered, a deafening explosion kicked up earth and debris further ahead of Shaw. Even from a distance, the shockwave shook Shaw's very bone. Dust filled the air, mingling with panicked shouts and the maddened cries of beasts. His first instinct was to glance upwards, searching the twilight for the telltale silhouettes of wyverns. But the sky above remained clear. "Ira ain't attacking us." "Then who?" Shaw's eyes darted across the caravan, trying to pinpoint the source of the attack. More blasts erupted, tearing through the heart of the convoy, but this time, the explosions were followed by strange sounds. An unending series of echoing cracks and snaps in a staccato rhythm, like 1,000 angry hornets beating their wings in unison.